Hello, my friend. Today I bring you another lost legend from the depths of Middle-earth. Close your eyes, feel the magic surround you. Our journey begins. In the deep places of Ethermore, where ancient stones remember the first songs and darkness holds counsel with itself, something stirred that had long been still. The great roots of the elder oak, whose branches once sheltered the free peoples in their golden years, trembled with a memory not their own, a memory of fire, of shadow, and of words spoken in the tongue that breaks. Mithrandos, the grey, walked the twilight paths in those days, his staff gleaming with the pale light of stars long faded. The wind carried whispers from the eastern wastelands, where the black spire, that fell tower men called Mordor, had begun to cast its shadow longer with each passing moon. In the common tongue, the fearful called it the Tower of Despair, though few dared speak its name at all. The wizard paused at the crossing of three ancient roads, where a standing stone bore runes in the old script. His grey eyes, deep as mountain pools, studied the carved words that seemed to shift and writhe in the dying light. "Beware the sleeper in the dark places," they read, "for his dreams are becoming real." A raven alighted upon the stone, its black eyes holding an intelligence that belonged to no mere bird. It spoke a single word in the black speech, a word that made the very air grow cold and still. Mithrandos raised his staff, and clean white light drove the creature shrieking into the gathering dusk. "So," the wizard murmured to himself, his breath misting in the sudden chill. "The hour grows late indeed. The necromancer stirs, and his servants grow bold enough to speak their master's words beneath the open sky." He drew his grey cloak closer and set his face eastward toward the rising darkness. Behind him, the ancient stone began to crack, and by morning it would crumble to dust, its warning finally spent after long ages of faithful watching. In the distance, barely visible through the haze of evening, a red light pulsed like a malevolent star fallen to earth. The tower was growing, stone by cursed stone, and with each new block laid upon its foundations, the very fabric of the world grew thin. Soon, if the wise did not act, that light would be seen from every corner of the realm, and none would be able to look away. The wind carried the scent of burning iron and something else, something that spoke of deep places and ancient hungers stirring after long sleep. Mithrandos quickened his pace. There were messages to carry, counsels to call, and preparations to make. The second darkness was upon them, though few yet recognized its coming. In the eastern sky, the first stars appeared, cold and distant, but they seemed dimmer than they had the night before, as if something was slowly devouring their light. The wizard walked on through the gathering gloom, his staff the only beacon in a world that was, stone by stone, falling under shadow. Far ahead, where the black spire pierced the night like a blade, something laughed, a sound like breaking glass and dying hope. The necromancer was waking, and his dreams of dominion were taking shape in iron and flame. The Thornwood had stood since the elder days, when the world was young, and the songs of creation still echoed in every grove and dell. Its trees were tall and proud, their roots deep drinking from springs that had never known the touch of shadow. But on this grey morning, as mist wound between the ancient trunks like ghostly serpents, even the oldest oaks seemed to lean away from something, that should not be. Elenian Nimrodel, last keeper of the greenways, felt the disturbance as a cold weight upon her heart. She had tended these woods for near 3 centuries, watching over the secret paths and hidden glades where the memory of the first music still lingered. Her dwelling was a bower woven from living branches, where golden light fell in patterns that had remained unchanged since the world's youth. But now, the light came filtered and strange, as if passing through water that had gone bad. The leaves whispered secrets they should not know, and the very bark of the trees seemed to weep a dark sap that stained the earth black wherever it fell. "Melon," she called softly in the old tongue, summoning the forest's guardians. But where once would have come the swift feet of the forest folk and the bright songs of the tree speakers, now only silence answered, a silence that pressed against her heart like a stone. She walked deeper into the wood, following paths that she herself had traced in the years when the world was younger. Here was the singing grove, where once the trees had lifted their voices in harmonies that could heal both body and spirit. But the grove was silent now, its ancient songs replaced by a low humming that seemed to rise from the very roots, a sound like distant machinery, alien and wrong. At the grove's heart stood the eldest, a great beech whose trunk was wide as a small hall and whose crown had sheltered countless generations. His bark was silver white, inscribed with the living script that told the history of all growing things. But now, as Elenian approached, she saw with growing horror that new words were appearing, dark runes that writhed and twisted as she watched, spelling out messages of doom in scripts that hurt the eye to follow. "Old friend," she whispered, placing her hand upon the ancient bark, "what evil thing has touched you?" The tree shuddered at her touch, and for a moment she felt his pain, a deep anguish that spoke of roots torn and branches broken, not in body but in spirit. Through their connection, she saw what he had seen, a shadow moving beneath the earth, following the old root roads that connected all the forests of the world. It moved with purpose, seeking, always seeking, and where it passed, the very memory of joy was consumed. "The Dark Lord wakes," the eldest whispered, his voice like wind through dying leaves. "His roots reach deep, deeper than ours, and he drinks from springs that were poisoned in the first darkness. The trees remember Elenian. We remember what was, and we know what comes again." She felt tears upon her cheeks, tears that fell like silver rain and turned to crystal where they touched the ground. Around them, the other trees began to take up the lament, their voices joining in a song of mourning that had not been heard since the fall of the ancient kingdoms. "What would you have me do?" she asked, though her heart already knew the answer. "Go to the Grey Wanderer," the eldest replied. "Tell him that the root roads are compromised, that the enemy moves beneath the earth as well as above it. Tell him." The great tree's voice faded to barely a whisper. "Tell him that the forest remembers everything, and we know where the power is hidden." As she prepared to leave, Elenian looked back once more at the grove where she had spent so many peaceful years. Already the corruption was spreading, turning the silver bark to black and changing the ancient script to words of binding and command. Soon, if nothing was done, every tree in the wood would become a servant of the shadow, their voices raised not in songs of joy, but in chants of dominion. She wrapped her green cloak about her shoulders and set out upon the hidden paths, carrying with her the desperate warning of the trees. Behind her, the thornwood began its slow transformation from sanctuary to stronghold, its ancient guardians becoming unwilling servants of the rising dark. The whisper in the trees had become a scream, and that scream would echo across all the forests of the world before the end. The horses' hooves struck sparks from the ancient stones of the King's Road, each impact ringing like a hammer upon an anvil in the pre-dawn silence. Mithrandos rode hard through the grey twilight, his grey robe streaming behind him like storm clouds, his staff balanced across his knees and glowing with a light that never wavered despite the darkness pressing close on either side. Shadowmere bore him swiftly eastward, the great grey stallion's breath steaming in the cold air. Horse and rider had journeyed many roads together, through perils that would have daunted lesser hearts, but never had Mithrandos felt such urgency as he did now. The very wind seemed to whisper warnings, and the stars above grew dimmer with each mile they travelled toward the rising darkness. He had left the thornwood scarce an hour past, carrying with him Elenian's desperate message and the weight of knowledge that pressed upon his spirit like a physical burden. The trees had spoken truly. The enemy was moving beneath the earth as well as above it, corrupting the very foundations of the world. Time was growing short, shorter than even the wisest had dared to imagine. The road wound through hills that had once been green and fair, dotted with the ruins of watchtowers from the days when the kingdoms of men still stood guard against the darkness. Now, those towers were broken teeth against the sky, their stones scattered, and their purpose forgotten by all save those who remembered the elder days. In their shadows, Mithrandos glimpsed movement, dark shapes that fled from the light of his staff, but did not venture far. As dawn broke grey and cheerless over the eastern mountains, he came at last to the crossroads of sorrow, where 7 paths met beneath a standing stone older than memory. Here, in ages past, the great lords had sworn their oaths of alliance, and here the final defeat of the first darkness had been planned. The stone bore their name still, carved deep in the living rock, though wind and weather had worn them nearly smooth. Mithrandos dismounted and approached the stone, placing his hand upon its weathered surface. For a moment, the carved names blazed with silver fire, and he heard echoes of voices long stilled, voices raised in courage and determination, swearing oaths that had once seemed unbreakable. Yet they were broken, he murmured to himself, and the darkness returned stronger than before. Will it be different this time? Can it be different? Shadowmere nickered softly and turned his great head eastward. There, on the horizon, the black spire rose like a needle of shadow against the pale sky. Even at this distance, its malevolent presence could be felt, a weight upon the spirit, a cold that no fire could warm. Red light pulsed at its crown, and with each pulse, the very air seemed to grow thicker and more oppressive. The wizard climbed back into his saddle and urged his mount onward. They had leagues yet to travel before they reached the borders of the Thornwood, and then more leagues still to the hidden valley where the White Council would soon convene. But first, there was another task, one that could not wait for councils and debate. As they rode, Mithrandos felt the weight of the ring upon the chain about his neck. Not the great ring, which lay hidden still in distant places, but one of the lesser rings, a band of silver set with a blue stone that held within it the light of the first star. It had been given to him in the elder days by one whose name was now legend, and its light had never failed him in all his wanderings. But now, as they drew nearer to the shadow's reach, he felt the ring grow cold against his chest. The enemy's power was growing indeed, if it could touch even the works of the Eldar with its corruption. Soon, even the lesser rings might fail, and then what defense would remain against the darkness? The sun climbed higher, but its light seemed weak and watery, as if something was drawing away its strength. Behind them, the crossroads of sorrow faded into the morning haze. But ahead, the road stretched on, leading ever eastward toward the place where light and shadow would meet in final battle. Mithrandos pulled his grey cloak closer about his shoulders and rode on, a lone figure against the vast emptiness of the world. Time was running short, and there were still so many preparations to make, so many allies to gather, so many hopes to kindle in hearts that had grown weary with long watching. But first, he must reach the watchtowers of the borderlands, where the last guardians kept their lonely vigil. They, at least, would know the truth of what was coming, even if they could do little to prevent it. The road stretched on, and the shadow grew ever longer. The borderlands stretched before them like a wound upon the earth, a vast expanse of twisted rock and poisoned streams where nothing green had grown for more years than mortal memory could reach. Here, at the very edge of the world's healing, the influence of the Black Spire could be felt like a fever in the bones, a sickness that sapped strength and hope with every breath. Mithrandos drew rein at the crest of the last hill, looking out across the desolation toward his destination. Mordor rose before him now in all its terrible majesty, a spear of black stone thrust up from the earth's heart to pierce the very sky. Its walls were smooth as glass and dark as midnight, rising in impossible spirals that hurt the eye to follow. At its crown, the red light pulsed with a rhythm like a great heart beating, and with each pulse, ripples of corruption spread outward through the air itself. "Never have I seen its like," he murmured to Shadowmere, though the great horse could offer no comfort now. Even his brave heart trembled at the sight of such concentrated malice. In the first darkness, our enemy built no towers. He worked through treachery and lies, corruption and decay. But this is different. This is a declaration of war written in stone and shadow. The tower stood upon an island of black rock in the center of a vast crater, connected to the mainland by a single causeway that gleamed like polished obsidian. Around its base, lesser structures clustered like parasites, forges and armories, barracks and dungeons, all wreathed in smoke and lit by fires that burned without fuel. Even at this distance, the sound of hammering could be heard, metal upon metal, as the enemy's servants labored day and night to prepare for war. But it was not the tower's size that struck fear into the wizard's heart, nor even the visible signs of the army gathering in its shadow. It was the wrongness of the thing, the way it seemed to exist, not quite in the same world as everything around it. The very stones seemed to bend reality around them, creating pockets of deeper darkness where the laws of nature held no sway. As he watched, a flock of great birds rose from the tower's heights, not the clean creatures of the air, but twisted things with wings like bat's leather and eyes that burned with malevolent fire. They circled the spire 3 times, their harsh cries echoing across the wasteland, before wheeling southward toward the lands where free folk still dwelt. Messengers, Mithrandos said grimly, or perhaps scouts, seeking weakness in our defenses. Either way, their flight bodes ill for those who would stand against the shadow. He urged Shadowmere forward, down the treacherous path that led into the borderlands proper. The very air grew thick and oppressive as they descended, heavy with the stench of sulfur and burning iron. Strange lights flickered in the depths of the crater, and occasionally the ground would shudder as if something vast moved beneath it. At the crater's edge, where the causeway began its span across the poisoned moat that surrounded the island, Mithrandos finally halted. Here, hidden among the twisted rocks, were the remains of an ancient watchtower, one of many that had once guarded this frontier in the days when men still dared to keep vigil against the darkness. The tower was broken now, its upper stories collapsed and its walls blackened with fire. But in its depths, carved into the living rock, were chambers that had survived even the shadow's touch. Here, if the old tales spoke truly, was hidden one of the Palantiri, the seeing stones of the ancient lords, which could show the watcher all that passed in distant places. If it still functions, the wizard murmured, if the enemy has not claimed it for his own, then perhaps we may learn something of his plans before it is too late. But as he prepared to enter the ruined tower, a new sound reached his ears, the measured tread of marching feet, echoing from the causeway that led to Mordor. A column of armored figures was approaching, their black mail glinting in the red light of the tower's crown. At their head rode a figure in robes of midnight blue, bearing a staff topped with a crystal that pulsed with the same malevolent rhythm as the great tower itself. Mithrandos drew back into the shadow of the broken stones, wrapping his grey cloak about him and dimming the light of his own staff to barely a glimmer. The enemy was abroad indeed, and in greater strength than he had dared to imagine. Whatever mission had brought him to these desolate lands, it would have to wait. For now, mere survival was challenge enough. The column passed within a stone's throw of his hiding place, and in their leader's face, he saw something that chilled his blood more than all the tower's malice. It was a face he recognized, though changed beyond easy recognition. One who had once walked in the light, but had chosen to serve the shadow in exchange for power beyond mortal ken. The enemy had servants among the wise themselves. The corruption ran deeper than any had suspected, and the battle for the world's future would be fought not only with sword and spell, but with the darker weapons of treachery and betrayal. As the column disappeared into the wasteland, Mithrandos emerged from his hiding place and looked once more upon the black spire. Its red light seemed brighter now, more triumphant, as if it knew that discovery and despair walked hand in hand in the hearts of its enemies. Time was growing short indeed. The descent into the broken watchtower felt like a journey into the very bowels of the earth. Each step down the ancient stairs took Mithrandos deeper into shadow, deeper into the accumulated weight of years and sorrow that pressed upon these stones like a physical thing. His staff provided the only light, its clean silver radiance pushing back the darkness that seemed almost alive in its hunger to devour all illumination. The walls bore the scars of ancient battle, deep gouges where swords had struck stone, blast marks where fire and lightning had been unleashed in desperate struggle. In the flickering light of his staff, Mithrandos could see the remains of the tower's last defenders, skeletons still clad in rusted mail, their fleshless hands clutching weapons that had long since crumbled to dust. "They died well," he murmured, pausing to honor their sacrifice with a moment's silence. They held the line when hope was failing and bought time for others to escape. May their courage be remembered when the final tally is made. Deeper he went, following stairs that had been carved from the living rock in the elder days. The very stone seemed to weep here, moisture seeping from the walls and pooling on the floor in patterns that resembled tears. The air grew thick and hard to breathe, heavy with the weight of accumulated despair. At last, he reached the lowest chamber, a circular room whose walls were inscribed with protective runes that still glowed faintly with their own inner light. At the room's center, upon a pedestal of white marble that seemed untouched by the corruption above, sat the Palantir, the seeing stone of the ancient lords. It was smaller than he had expected, no larger than a man's head, but perfectly spherical and smooth as glass. Within its depths, lights moved and swirled like distant stars, and as Mithrandos approached, he felt the weight of its attention settle upon him like a physical presence. "Ancient One," he spoke aloud, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "I am Mithrandos the Grey, servant of the secret fire. I come seeking knowledge of the enemy's plans, that the free peoples might better prepare for the trials ahead." The stone pulsed once, acknowledging his words, and then its surface began to clear. Images formed in its depths, visions of distant places and times, some past, some present, some perhaps yet to come. Mithrandos placed his hands upon the sphere's surface and opened his mind to its revelations. He saw the Black Spire as it had been in the beginning, not the mighty fortress it now appeared, but a simple spear of black stone thrust up from the earth's heart by powers that predated the world's making. Around its base, the enemy's servants had labored for uncounted years, adding ring upon ring, level upon level, until it had become the monstrosity that now dominated the eastern horizon. But that was not the worst of what the stone revealed. In the tower's depths, in chambers carved from the living rock, he saw forges that burned with fires stolen from the heart of creation itself. Upon their anvils, weapons were being shaped, not mere swords and spears, but artifacts of power that could command the very elements and bend the will of all living things. And at the tower's crown, in a chamber wreathed in smoke and shadow, he saw the one who commanded it all, not the Dark Lord himself, for that presence was mercifully veiled from the stone's sight, but his chief lieutenant, the necromancer, who had claimed dominion over death itself. His face was hidden beneath a hood of midnight blue, but his hands, as they moved over charts and maps, were pale as bone and marked with runes that seemed to writhe and shift in the stone's revealing light. The necromancer spoke, and though no sound reached Mithrandos through the stone, he could read the words upon those bloodless lips. "Soon," they said. "Soon the web will be complete, and all the world's threads will lead to me. The tree folk bend to my will, the stone lords serve my purpose, and even the wise begin to doubt their cause. When the stars align as the prophecies foretell, then shall the final darkness fall, and none shall stand against my master's reign." The vision faded, leaving Mithrandos alone with his horror and his newfound knowledge. The enemy's plans were further advanced than anyone had dared imagine. Already his influence was spreading through the very foundations of the world, corrupting not just the surface lands, but the deep places where the earth's power had its source. He lifted his hands from the stone's surface and stepped back, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had seen. The Palantir's light dimmed and became quiescent once more, its duty done for now. But even as he prepared to leave, he felt a new presence in the chamber, something that had not been there when he entered. From the shadows at the room's edge, a figure stepped forward, tall and proud, clad in robes that had once been white, but were now stained with ash and sorrow. It was Sauron the Wise, once the greatest of the Order of Wizards, now fallen into shadow through pride and the lure of forbidden knowledge. "You should not have come here, Mithrandos," Sauron said, his voice like wind through empty halls. "The stone shows only what its master wills it to show. You have seen what he wanted you to see, learned what he wanted you to learn. Now you will carry his despair back to your precious council, and doubt will spread like poison through their ranks." Mithrandos raised his staff, its light blazing bright in the confined space. "Stand aside, Sauron. I have no quarrel with you, but neither will I let you bar my way." The fallen wizard laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Quarrel? There is no quarrel between us, old friend. We serve the same master now, though you do not yet know it. The web is complete, the trap is sprung, and all who think themselves free are merely dancing to our master's tune." With that, he was gone, vanishing like smoke on the wind, leaving only the echo of his laughter and the growing certainty that the darkness had indeed spread further than any had dared to imagine. Mithrandos climbed the stairs with greater haste than he had descended them, eager to escape the oppressive weight of the ruined tower and the knowledge it had forced upon him. Above, Shadowmere waited patiently in the shadow of the broken walls, but even the great horse seemed diminished by proximity to such concentrated evil. They rode hard from that place, leaving the borderlands behind with all speed, but no distance could erase what the wizard had learned, and no haste could outrun the implications of Sauron's words. The enemy's web was indeed vast, his servants numerous, and his plans more advanced than the wisest had imagined. Yet still there was hope. There had to be hope, for without it, all was already lost. 3 days' hard riding brought Mithrandos to the hidden valley of Rivendell, where the last free council of the wise maintained their ancient vigil against the darkness. The valley lay concealed among the mountains, like a jewel in a setting of stone, protected by veils of mist and enchantment that had endured since the elder days. Here, where the music of falling water mingled with the songs of the tree folk, the memory of better times was preserved against the growing shadow. But even Rivendell felt different now, touched by the same unease that had spread across all the world. The great hall where the council met was subdued, its usual brightness dimmed by the weight of grim tidings that seemed to arrive with every passing day. Around the circular table of white stone, the members of the White Council sat in troubled deliberation, their faces grave with the knowledge of impending doom. Elrondr the Wise presided over the gathering, his ageless features marked by a sorrow that seemed to deepen with each passing year. Beside him sat Galadriel the Fair, her golden light dimmed but not extinguished, and across from them brooded Radagar the Brown, whose love for all growing things had turned to bitter grief as he witnessed their slow corruption. "The enemy moves more swiftly than we anticipated," Elrondr was saying as Mithrandos entered the hall. "Our scouts report armies gathering in the eastern wastelands, and strange lights have been seen dancing over the ruins of the ancient kingdoms. Whatever dark purpose the necromancer serves, it draws near to fulfillment." Mithrandos took his place at the table, his grey robes travel-stained and his face drawn with weariness. "I bring news from the borderlands," he said without preamble. "I have looked into the Palantir of Tornhillion, and what I saw there bodes ill for all the free peoples." He recounted his vision in the broken watchtower, sparing no detail of the enemy's preparations or the corruption that spread through the deep places of the world. When he spoke of Sareth's fall and the web of influence that the necromancer had woven, a hush fell over the council that was deeper than mere silence. "If what you say is true," Galadriel said at last, her voice like wind through silver leaves, "then we are already defeated. How can we stand against an enemy who has corrupted the very foundations of creation?" "There is more," Mithrandos said heavily. "In the depths of the Black Tower, I glimpsed something that I had hoped never to see again. The enemy holds a prisoner, one whose knowledge of the ancient ways surpasses even our own." He paused, gathering strength for what he must reveal. "It is Thandur the Golden, last king of the Firstborn, who was thought lost in the War of Wrath. The necromancer has held him captive these many years, drawing from his mind the secrets of creation itself. The silence that followed was profound, weighted with the implications of this revelation. Thandur had been present at the world's making, had walked with the Valar themselves in the blessed realm beyond the sea. If the enemy had access to such knowledge, then no defense could stand against him. "We must attempt a rescue," Radagast said, his voice rough with emotion. "Whatever the cost, we cannot leave one of the Firstborn in the Shadow's grasp." "It would be folly," Elrondr replied sadly. "The tower is too well defended, its approaches too thoroughly watched. We would lose everything and save nothing." But Mithrandos shook his head. "Perhaps not everything. The Palantir showed me something else, a weakness in the enemy's plans that he does not suspect. Thandur may be captive in body, but his spirit remains free. Even now, he works to undermine his captor's purposes, planting false knowledge among the true, leading the necromancer's research down paths that will ultimately prove fruitless." He leaned forward, his grey eyes bright with sudden hope. "If we can find a way to communicate with him, to coordinate our efforts with his, then perhaps we can turn the enemy's greatest strength into his ultimate weakness." "And how do you propose we accomplish this miracle?" Galadriel asked, though her tone suggested she was not entirely without hope. Mithrandos reached into his robes and drew forth a crystal vial filled with liquid light, water from the Mirror of Stars, the sacred pool that lay at Rivendell's heart. The mirror shows not only what is, but what might be. If we can establish a connection through its waters, we might be able to reach across the darkness and speak with a captive king. The council debated long into the night, weighing risks against possibilities, hope against despair. In the end, it was decided that the attempt must be made, for without it, they had no chance at all against the growing darkness. As dawn broke over the hidden valley, the members of the White Council gathered around the Mirror of Stars. Its surface was perfectly still, reflecting not the sky above, but depths that seemed to go down forever. Mithrandos poured the sacred water into its depths, and immediately the mirror began to glow with its own inner light. Images formed in its depths, visions of the Black Tower and the chambers beneath, where shadows moved and whispered secrets in tongues that predated language itself. And there, in the deepest dungeon, they saw him, Thandor the Golden, last king of the Firstborn, bound with chains of shadow, but still defiant, still proud. His eyes met theirs across the impossible distance, and his lips moved in words that reached them as clearly as if he stood beside the mirror's edge. "The web is not complete," he said. "There is still time, still hope. But you must act swiftly, for the final phase of the plan approaches, and when it begins, all will be lost." The connection held for only a moment before the mirror's surface went dark, but it was enough. They had made contact with the captive king, and through him, they might yet find a way to victory. But time was growing short, and the enemy's power grew with each passing day. Whatever they were going to do, it would have to be soon. In the deepest chamber of Mordor, where no light of sun or star had ever penetrated, the necromancer bent over his work with the patience of one who had learned to measure time in centuries rather than years. His laboratory was a marvel of twisted ingenuity, alchemical apparatus wrought from materials that should not exist, burning with fires that consumed darkness itself and gave forth illumination that hurt the soul to perceive. Upon tables of black marble lay the fruits of his labors, rings of power forged in mockery of the great rings, amulets that could command the very elements, and weapons that thirsted for the blood of the righteous. But these were mere trinkets compared to his greatest work, the great web of influence that now stretched across the world, invisible threads of corruption that touched every living thing. At the chamber's heart stood a throne, carved from a single block of obsidian, its arms and back inscribed with runes that seemed to writhe and shift in the fitful light. Upon this throne sat a figure that might once have been a man, but was now something far removed from mortality. His flesh was pale as bone, his eyes empty pits that held the cold fire of stars dying in the void. This was Morgul, the Deathless, the necromancer of Mordor, servant of powers that had existed before the world's making and would endure long after its ending. He had been many things in his long existence, king and philosopher, warrior and sage, but always he had thirsted for knowledge, and that thirst had ultimately led him to this dark apotheosis. Before him, suspended in the air by chains of shadow and malice, hung the broken form of Thandor the Golden. The last king of the Firstborn was barely recognizable now, his golden hair turned to silver, his face marked by centuries of torment. Yet still there was light in his eyes, still defiance in the set of his shoulders. "You waste your time with this pretense of strength," Morgul said, his voice like the whisper of wind through empty tombs. "I have had centuries to break you, and I will have centuries more. In the end, you will tell me what I wish to know, the location of the great ring, the words of unmaking that can destroy the very foundations of creation." Thandor raised his head with visible effort. "I have told you already. The ring is lost, cast into the void when the ancient kingdoms fell. As for the words of unmaking, they were spoken only once at the world's beginning and forgotten by design. Even I do not know them." The necromancer laughed, a sound like breaking glass. You lie beautifully, old king, but I have ways of extracting truth from even the most reluctant subjects. Observe. He gestured to one of his servants, a creature that had once been human, but was now something else entirely. It approached bearing a crystal sphere filled with swirling mists, and at Morgul's command, it placed the sphere against Thandor's forehead. Immediately, the king's face contorted in agony as the sphere began to glow. Within its depths, images formed, memories torn from Thandor's mind with surgical precision. Morgul leaned forward, studying each vision with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient texts. "Ah," he breathed as one particular memory crystallized in the sphere. "Now we approach truth. I see a hobbit hole, green and pleasant, where dwells one who knows not what he possesses. And I see you, noble Thandor, speaking with the grey wizard about the need to keep certain secrets hidden." Thandor's eyes blazed with desperate fury. "You know nothing. The visions lie. They show only what you wish to see." But Morgul was not deceived. On the contrary, they show exactly what I need to know. The Great Ring exists. It is hidden among the simple folk of the Western lands, and certain members of your precious White Council know its location. This knowledge alone is worth the centuries I have spent breaking your spirit. He rose from his throne, his robes billowing around him like smoke given form. "But there is more, is there not? I sense deeper secrets, older truths buried beneath layers of memory and pain. The words of creation, the song that shaped the world. You were there when it was sung, were you not?" Despite his torment, Thandor managed a bitter smile. "I was there, yes. I heard the music of the Ainur as it shaped the void into form. But that song cannot be unsung, Morgul. What was made in harmony cannot be destroyed by discord alone. Cannot it?" The necromancer circled his prisoner like a predator stalking wounded prey. "I have spent long years studying the nature of creation, learning how each note relates to the whole. Already I have found discordant themes, places where the song rings false, where reality can be adjusted. The corruption spreading through the root roads is proof of this. Even now, the great trees sing my songs instead of their own." He gestured toward the crystal sphere, which still pulsed with stolen memories. "But you, noble king, you remember the original melodies. With your knowledge, I can compose a countersong, a music of unmaking that will reduce creation itself to the primordial silence from which it came. And in that silence, my master will build a new world, one shaped entirely to his will." Thandor's face went ashen as he understood the full scope of the necromancer's ambition. "You mad fool. You speak of destroying not just this world, but all possible worlds. The music encompasses everything that is, was, or ever could be. To silence it would mean the end of existence itself." "Yes," Morgul replied with satisfaction. "Perfect order, perfect silence. No more the chaotic clamor of individual wills struggling against the grand design. No more the messy complications of hope and love and free choice. Only the eternal peace of absolute dominion." As if summoned by his words, a presence filled the chamber, vast, terrible, and utterly alien to all that lived and breathed. The very stones of the tower trembled, and the fires in the necromancer's apparatus burned lower, as if afraid to give offense. Morgul prostrated himself upon the floor, his voice dropping to a whisper of religious awe. "Master," he breathed, "the work proceeds as you commanded. Soon I shall have all the knowledge needed to begin the great unmaking, The armies gather, the web tightens, and even the wise begin to despair. The presence spoke without words, its thoughts pressing directly into the minds of all who heard. Its voice was the sound of breaking worlds, of stars dying in the void, of hope itself, guttering out like a candle in an endless wind. The ring, it said. Find the ring. Without it, all other plans are as dust. It shall be found, Master. My servants search even now, and I have agents among the enemy who will soon provide the knowledge we seek. The presence lingered a moment longer, its attention falling upon Thandur like a weight of lead. The captive king met that terrible regard without flinching, though it cost him more than any physical torment. Break him, the Dark Lord commanded. His knowledge is the key to all. When he speaks the words of creation, the countersong can begin. Then it was gone, leaving behind only the lingering scent of sulfur and the echo of cosmic malice. Morgul rose slowly, his pale face alight with fanatic devotion. You heard our master's will, he said to Thandur. Your suffering has only begun. I have tools and techniques that will make your previous torments seem like gentle caresses, and I have all the time in the world to apply them. But even as he spoke, something flickered in the depths of the crystal sphere, a reflection of light that had no business being there, a suggestion of cleaner energies touching the very heart of the Dark Tower. For just a moment, Thandur's eyes brightened with hope. The connection had been made. The White Council had found a way to reach him across the darkness. Whatever trials lay ahead, he would not face them alone. Morgul noticed nothing, already turning to his instruments of torment with the eagerness of an artist approaching a fresh canvas. But in the sphere's depths, hidden beneath layers of stolen memory and projected pain, a different kind of magic was at work, one that drew its power not from domination and fear, but from the bonds of friendship and the unquenchable flame of hope. The real battle had begun, and its outcome would determine not just the fate of one world, but the survival of all existence itself. The confrontation came at the hour when night was deepest and hope seemed farthest away. Mithrandos stood at the foot of the Black Tower, his grey robes transformed to gleaming white in the heat of his power, his staff blazing like a fallen star against the oppressive darkness. Around him, the very stones of Mordurath's foundation trembled as two fundamental forces met in conflict. He had come alone, as he knew he must. This was not a battle that could be won by armies or councils, but only by the direct clash of opposing wills. The White Council had protested, of course, Elrondr speaking of foolish sacrifice, Galadriel of duties left unfulfilled. But they did not understand, could not understand, the full scope of what was at stake. The Great Ring was lost indeed, but not destroyed as Thandur had claimed. It lay hidden in the western lands, carried by one who knew not what burden he bore. Soon the enemy would discover this truth, and when he did, the final darkness would fall with a swiftness that would leave no time for last-ditch defenses or desperate stratagems, unless the necromancer could be stopped here and now, while his attention was focused on breaking the captive king. Morgul, Mithrandos called, his voice echoing from the tower's heights. I name you Oathbreaker and Betrayer. Come forth and face judgment for your crimes. The response was immediate. The great gates of the tower, wrought from metal that drank light and gave back only shadow, ground open with a sound like breaking bones. From within came a procession of horrors, servants of the necromancer who had once been men and elves, but were now creatures of pure malice given form. At their head walked Morgul himself, no longer troubling to maintain even the pretense of mortality. His flesh was translucent now, revealing the network of dark veins that carried poison instead of blood through his transformed body. His eyes were wells of starlight frozen in ice, and when he spoke, his words carried the chill of spaces between the worlds. "Mithrandos the Meddler," he said with mock courtesy, "how good of you to come. I was wondering when you would gather the courage to face me directly, rather than hiding behind your precious council and their endless debates. I come to offer you one final chance," the wizard replied, though both knew the words were mere formality. "Renounce your dark master, release the captive king, and perhaps some small measure of your original nature can be preserved." Morgul laughed, and the sound was like winter wind through a charnel house. "Preserve what? This weakened flesh, this conscience that whimpers in the corners of my mind? I have transcended such limitations, old friend. I have become something greater than mere mortality could ever aspire to be." As he spoke, power gathered around him, not the clean light that blazed from Mithrandos' staff, but something older and more terrible. It was the power of the void itself, the darkness that existed before creation and would remain after all things had passed away. Where it touched the ground, the very stones began to corrode, eaten away by absolute negation. "Behold," Morgul continued, raising his arms to encompass the devastation around them. "This is what awaits your precious creation. Not conquest, not subjugation, but perfect and eternal silence. When my master's work is complete, there will be no more pain, because there will be no more feeling, no more conflict, because there will be no more choice, only the peace of utter emptiness." Mithrandos raised his staff, and the light that blazed from it was like the first dawn breaking over the world. "Then we have nothing more to discuss." The battle that followed was fought on levels beyond the merely physical. Reality itself groaned under the strain as two cosmic principles wrestled for dominance. Where Mithrandos' light touched the corrupted ground, green shoots began to sprout, flowers bloomed in impossible profusion, and the very air grew sweet with the scent of healing. But where Morgul's darkness spread, existence itself began to fray, revealing glimpses of the terrible void that lay beneath all things. They struck at each other with weapons forged from pure will. Mithrandos wielding the secret fire that burned at the heart of creation, Morgul drawing upon the primal darkness that had existed before the first word was spoken. Lightning crashed between them, but it was not the lightning of storms. This was the raw energy of competing realities, each trying to impose its vision upon the substance of the world. Around them, the necromancer's servants closed in, but they found themselves unable to approach the circle of conflict. The very air had become too charged with opposing forces for mortal or immortal flesh to endure. They could only watch as their master battled the last free wizard in a contest that would determine the fate of all existence. High above, in the tower's heights, Thandor felt the vibrations of battle and knew that the final moment had come. The connection established through the mirror of stars still held, though weakly, and through it he could sense the desperate hope of the White Council. They were preparing some great working, some spell or stratagem that might tip the balance, If only Mithrandos could hold out long enough. But the grey wizard was weakening. For all his power, he was still bound by the limitations of incarnate existence, while Morgul had abandoned such constraints long ago. The necromancer's strength seemed inexhaustible, drawn as it was from the infinite reservoir of the void itself. "You cannot win," Morgul taunted as their battle raged on. "I am become death incarnate, the ending of all stories, the silence that follows the last word. What hope can your little light have against the darkness that will swallow all?" But Mithrandos smiled, even as his strength began to fail. "You speak truly of endings," he said, "but you forget that every ending is also a beginning. Watch and learn what it means to serve the secret fire." With that, he did something that Morgul had not expected. He ceased his attack and opened his defenses completely. The necromancer's darkness rushed in like a tide, enveloping the wizard in shadows that should have destroyed him instantly. Instead, Mithrandos blazed brighter than ever, his light no longer fighting the darkness, but transforming it. Where shadow touched flame, it became not destroyed but changed, converted into something new and clean and bright. The secret fire revealed its true nature then, not as a weapon of war, but as the fundamental creative force that turned potential into reality, chaos into cosmos. Morgul screamed as his own power was turned against him, the darkness he had wielded for so long becoming the instrument of his undoing. His form began to waver, the corruption that sustained him burning away like dross in a furnace. For a moment, just a moment, something almost human flickered in his frozen eyes. "I remember," he whispered, and in that whisper was all the sorrow of choices made and innocence lost. Then the light consumed him entirely, and where the necromancer had stood, only a pile of ash remained. The great tower of Mordor shuddered once, twice, and then began to collapse, its stones returning to the earth from which they had been so unnaturally raised. Mithrandos staggered as the strain of the battle took its toll. He had won, but at a cost that would echo through the ages. The secret fire still burned within him, but dimmed now, its light grown gentle and ready for the final rest. As the tower fell, he thought he heard a voice on the wind, Tandor's voice, speaking words of gratitude and blessing. The captive king was free at last. His long torment ended. That alone made everything worthwhile. The darkness was broken, if only for a time. Whatever came next, the free peoples would face it with hope rather than despair. And in the end, that might make all the difference. The journey back to Rivendell took 7 days, though it might have been 7 years for all the weariness that Mithrandos carried in his bones. Shadowmere bore him gently through paths that seemed somehow brighter than before, as if the destruction of Mordorath had lifted a shadow from the very air. Birds sang where silence had reigned, and green shoots pushed through soil that had been barren for generations. Yet for all these signs of renewal, the wizard's heart remained heavy. He had won a victory, yes, but at what cost? The strain of channeling the secret fire had left him changed, diminished in ways that went far deeper than mere physical exhaustion. He felt the pull of distant shores, the call of rest that comes to all who have served their time in the great battle between light and shadow. But his work was not yet finished. The necromancer's death had dealt a grievous blow to the enemy's plans, but it had not ended them. Somewhere in the darkness, the Dark Lord still brooded, still plotted, still reached out with tendrils of malice to corrupt all that lived and breathed. And the great ring remained hidden, its power undiminished, its potential for both salvation and destruction unchanged. The White Council was assembled when he arrived, their faces grave with the knowledge of what had transpired. The mirror had shown them something of the battle's course, enough to know that victory had been bought with sacrifice. They welcomed him with honor due a hero, but also with the sorrow of those who recognize that something precious has been lost. "The tower has fallen," Galadriel said, her voice soft as evening wind. "We felt its destruction even here, like a great weight lifting from the world's shoulders. Yet you return to us changed, Mithrandos. What price did victory demand?" The grey wizard, though his robes were whiter now, bleached by the secret fire's touch, took his place at the council table with movements that spoke of great weariness. "The price was acceptable," he said simply. "Morgul is destroyed, his works undone, his servants scattered to the winds. The immediate threat has passed." "But," Elrondr prompted, sensing the weight of unspoken concerns. "But the greater enemy remains," Mithrandos replied. "The Dark Lord himself still sits in his fortress beyond the mountains, and his power is far from broken. If anything, the necromancer's death may drive him to more desperate measures. When he discovers that his lieutenant has failed, his wrath will be terrible to behold." Radagar leaned forward, his brown robes rustling like autumn leaves. "Then what do you counsel? How do we prepare for what is to come?" Mithrandos was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts like a man preparing to speak words that could not be unsaid. "We must accelerate our plans," he said, finally. "The time for waiting and watching is over. The ring must be found, and found quickly, before the enemy's agents locate it. And when it is found—" He paused, the weight of destiny heavy upon his words. "It must be destroyed." The silence that followed was profound. They all knew of the ring's existence, of course, the last and greatest of the rings of power, forged in secret by the Dark Lord in the fires of Mount Doom. But to speak so casually of its destruction was to contemplate something that had never been attempted, might not even be possible. "You speak of impossibilities," Elrondr said at last. "The great ring is bound to its creator by bonds that cannot be broken. To unmake it would require returning it to the fires in which it was forged," Mithrandos finished. "Yes, I know. It means a journey into the very heart of the enemy's realm, past armies and fortresses, through perils that would daunt the bravest heart. It means almost certain death for whoever undertakes the task." "Then why propose it?" Galadriel asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Because the alternative is worse," the wizard replied. "Tandor spoke truly when he warned of the necromancer's ultimate plan. The enemy seeks not mere conquest, but the complete unmaking of creation itself. He would reduce all existence to primordial silence, then rebuild it according to his will. The ring is the key to that plan. Without it, he remains merely a threat to this world. With it, he becomes a danger to all possible worlds." The debate that followed lasted through the night and into the following day. Some argued for hiding the ring, others for using its power against the enemy. But in the end, Mithrandos' wisdom prevailed. The ring could not be hidden forever, nor could its power be wielded without corruption. Destruction was the only sure path to victory, no matter how impossible it might seem. Then we are agreed, Elrondr said as dawn broke over the hidden valley. The ring must be found and destroyed. But who will undertake such a quest? What mortal or immortal being could hope to succeed where armies would fail? Mithrandos smiled then, the first true smile he had worn since returning from the tower's ruins. I think, he said, that we may be approaching this problem from the wrong direction. We assume that great tasks require great heroes, that only the mighty can achieve the impossible. But sometimes, perhaps most times, it is the small and humble who accomplish what the proud and powerful cannot. He rose from his chair, his white robes catching the morning light. I must journey westward to the green lands where the simple folk dwell. There are hobbits there, creatures so removed from the great affairs of the world that they barely know such affairs exist. And among them, he paused, remembering a vision from the Palantir, a glimpse of a comfortable hobbit hole and the one who dwelt within. Among them may lie our salvation. The council made ready for departure then, each member taking on tasks that would prepare the world for the trials ahead. But as they dispersed, Galadriel approached Mithrandos with concern written clearly upon her ageless features. You speak of hobbits and simple folk, she said quietly, but I see a different truth written in your eyes. This quest will not be theirs alone to bear. You mean to accompany them, don't you? To guide them on the darkest of all possible roads. Mithrandos nodded, though the gesture seemed to cost him great effort. It is my doom, he said simply. I have looked into the fires of creation and emerged changed. The power that saved me from the necromancer's darkness will not sustain me much longer in this world. When the quest begins, I will go with them as far as I am able. After that, he shrugged, accepting fate with the resignation of one who has already made his peace with mortality. The grey have become white, Galadriel murmured, understanding more than his words had spoken. And the white must in time pass beyond the circles of this world. Is there no other way? There is always another way, Mithrandos replied, but not always a better one. The quest will require sacrifice from all who undertake it. If my sacrifice can light their path even a little way, then it will be worthily made. With that, he took his leave, setting out once more upon the winding roads that led toward the sunset and the green lands beyond. Behind him, the White Council began their preparations for war, knowing that the final battle was at hand. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the slim hope that courage might yet triumph over despair. The wheel of fate was turning, and none could say where it would stop. The lonely mountain stood against the sky like a broken tooth, its peak shattered by dragon fire and its halls echoing with memories of ancient glory. Once it had been Erebor the Great, mightiest of all the dwarf kingdoms, where the hammers of the mountain lords had shaped wonders that made even the elves pause in admiration. Now it was a tomb, its treasures guarded by Smaug the Terrible, last of the great fire drakes, who had claimed it for his own in fire and ruin. But even tombs could be awakened, and even the mightiest dragons could be overcome by courage and cunning. This was the thought that occupied Mithrandos as he rode through the grey lands that surrounded the mountain, studying its approaches and measuring the depth of shadow that lay upon it. The dragon was old now, grown complacent in his solitude, and age brought weakness even to such as he. More importantly, Smaug's presence had served the Dark Lord's purposes well. The destruction of Erebor had removed the strongest bastion of resistance in the north, leaving the lands beyond vulnerable to corruption and conquest. But if the mountain could be reclaimed, if the dwarves could be stirred to remember their ancient strength, the thought brought him to a halt at the edge of a vast clearing, where the remnants of Dale spread out before him like a vision of desolation. The great city of men had fallen when the dragon came, its towers toppled and its walls cast down. Yet even here, among the broken stones and charred timber, he could see signs of renewal, green shoots pushing through the rubble, birds nesting in the ruins, the slow but inexorable return of life to places where death had reigned supreme. "It can be done," he murmured to himself, his breath misting in the cold air. The dragon can be roused from his lair, the mountain reclaimed, the kingdom restored. But it will require the right catalyst, the proper spark to kindle the flame of dwarven pride. He had been riding for days through the lands of the north, following paths that few remembered and fewer still would dare to travel. The great war that was coming would be won or lost, not by grand armies clashing on traditional battlefields, but by 1,000 smaller victories, alliances forged, ancient grudges set aside, sleeping powers awakened to face the common threat. The dwarves were key to this strategy. Scattered though they were, driven from their ancestral homes by dragonfire and orc blade, they retained the strength and skill that had once made them the master craftsmen of the world. Their weapons could cut through armor that turned aside mortal steel. Their walls could stand against sieges that would break lesser fortifications. If they could be united, if their loyalty could be won. But they were a proud people, slow to trust and quick to take offense. They would not march at the bidding of wizards or the pleading of elves. They would need their own reasons, their own cause to rally around. And what cause could be greater than the restoration of their greatest kingdom? Mithrandos smiled to himself as the plan took shape in his mind. It would be dangerous, certainly. Rousing Smaug from his long slumber would bring death and destruction before it brought victory. But sometimes destruction was necessary to clear the ground for new growth. Sometimes the old had to be torn down before the new could be built. He turned Shadowmere eastward toward the Grey Mountains, where the remnants of Durin's folk maintained their precarious existence in halls carved from the living rock. There he would find Thorin Oakenshield, heir to the throne of Erebor, and the last hope of the dwarven people. The young prince was proud and sometimes foolish, driven by the weight of his heritage and the shame of his exile. But he had the fire of his ancestors burning within him, and fire was what this plan would require. The journey took him through passes that echoed with the memory of ancient battles, across valleys where the bones of heroes lay beneath cairns of weathered stone. Here and there he passed the ruins of watchtowers and border forts, testament to the great alliance that had once guarded these lands against the darkness. That alliance was broken now, its members scattered or fallen, but perhaps it could be forged anew. At last, he came to the hidden entrance of Ered Mithrin, the secret hall where the descendants of Durin maintained their desperate vigil against the coming night. The guards who challenged him wore mail that had been mended a dozen times, carried weapons that had been reforged from the fragments of greater blades, but their eyes still held the fierce pride of their people. and their voices rang with the ancient challenge. Who goes there? What business have you in the halls of the Mountain Kings? I am Mithrandos the White, he replied, throwing back his hood to reveal features marked by recent trials. I come seeking Thorin, son of Thrain, heir to the throne of Erebor. I bring word of hope and the promise of a quest that will echo through the ages. The guards conferred among themselves in the rapid, harsh syllables of the dwarf tongue. Then one stepped forward with the measured courtesy that marked a trained herald. Enter then, wizard, and be welcome. But know that many have come with promises before you, and few have brought anything but disappointment. The halls of Ered Mithrin were poor by the standards of the ancient dwarf kingdoms, but they possessed a stark beauty that spoke of endurance rather than wealth. The stone had been worked with loving care, every surface smooth and true, every arch precisely calculated to bear its burden. Here was craftsmanship of the highest order, practiced by those who had nothing left but their skill and their pride. Thorin Oakenshield received him in the Hall of Thrones, a chamber that had been built to house the seats of all the dwarven kings, but now held only empty stone. The prince himself sat upon a simple chair of carved oak, his dark hair streaked with premature grey, his eyes heavy with the weight of unfulfilled destiny. Around him stood his companions, warriors and craftsmen who had shared his exile, who had followed him into the wilderness rather than bend the knee to lesser lords. So, Thorin said without preamble, his voice carrying the grudging respect due to one of the Istari. The White Wizard comes to us at last. Do you bring word from your council? Have the high and mighty finally remembered that dwarves still live and breathe in these mountains? Mithrandos approached the throne with measured steps, his staff clicking against the stone floor. I bring something better than words, Prince of Erebor. I bring the chance to reclaim what was lost, to restore the kingdom of your fathers, to see the Arkenstone shine once more in the halls beneath the mountain. The silence that followed was profound, weighted with years of hope deferred and dreams abandoned. When Thorin finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral, betraying nothing of the fire that surely burned within. Smaug the Mighty still lives, he said. The dragon guards the mountain and all its treasures. What army do you bring to face him? What force of arms could hope to succeed where heroes have failed? No army, Mithrandos replied. No force of arms at all, but I know of weaknesses that dragons possess, and I have learned of opportunities that may not come again. The time is ripe, Thorin Oakenshield. The wheel of fate turns, and those who seize the moment may find fortune smiling upon them. He began to speak then of plans within plans, of the greater war that was coming, and the role that Erebor might play in its outcome. He spoke of allies who waited to be summoned, of weapons that could pierce even dragon scale, of the ancient prophecies that spoke of the mountain's restoration. And as he spoke, he saw the light of hope kindle in Thorin's eyes, the dangerous, beautiful light of a dream that might yet become reality. The quest was taking shape, piece by careful piece. Soon all would be ready, and the long road to the mountain would begin. The Shire lay green and golden under the afternoon sun, its rolling hills and neat hedgerows a vision of peace in a world increasingly touched by shadow. Here, in the westernmost corner of the inhabited lands, the folk called hobbits pursued their quiet lives with a contentment that bordered on the sublime. They knew little of the great affairs that stirred beyond their borders, and cared less. Their concerns ran more to the proper tending of gardens, the brewing of ale, and the infinitely complex social negotiations that governed life in a small, close-knit community. Mithrandos walked the familiar paths with lighter steps than he had known in many months, his white robes exchanged for the grey that marked him as simply another traveller on the road. The very air seemed cleaner here, untainted by the corruption that spread like a plague through other lands. Children played in the meadows, their laughter carrying on the breeze like music, while their elders worked in gardens that bloomed with flowers whose names were known only to those who loved them. At the heart of this pastoral paradise stood Hobbiton, its round doors and windows glowing warmly in the late light. Smoke rose from countless chimneys, carrying the scent of dinner preparations and the promise of evenings spent in comfort before well-tended hearths. It was a scene that had remained unchanged for generations and would remain unchanged for generations more, if the growing darkness could be held at bay. Bag End sat at the hill's crown, like a jewel in a setting of green, its round door painted the particular shade of green that marked it as the dwelling of the Bagginses. Mithrandos paused at the gate, studying the neat garden and the carefully tended path, remembering another time when he had stood in this very spot. That had been years ago, when the world was younger and hope seemed less fragile. Now, as then, great events were stirring, and the quiet folk of the Shire would find themselves touched by affairs far beyond their understanding. He lifted the brass knocker, shaped like a dragon, though few hobbits would recognize the significance, and rapped 3 times upon the door. The sound echoed hollowly within, followed by the shuffle of feet and a voice raised in mild complaint about unexpected visitors at the dinner hour. The door opened to reveal a hobbit of middle years, well-fed and prosperous, with the soft hands of one who had never known real hardship. His waistcoat was of good cloth, his pipe of well-seasoned wood, and his expression one of polite but firm resistance to whatever disruption this stranger might represent. This was Bilbo Baggins, master of Bag End, and he wore his respectability like armor against the uncertainties of the world. "Good evening," he said with the careful courtesy that hobbits employed when dealing with outsiders. "I'm afraid you've caught me at rather an awkward time. If you're selling something, I must tell you that I have all I need. If you're collecting for charity, I gave at the office, so to speak. And if you're looking for adventure..." He paused, his eyes taking in the wizard's travel-stained appearance and the staff that marked him as one of the big folk. "Well, I'm afraid you've come to the wrong place entirely." Mithrandos smiled, recognizing the speech as one that Bilbo had undoubtedly delivered to dozens of unwelcome visitors over the years. "Good evening, Master Baggins," he replied. "I am not selling, collecting, or seeking. Rather, I was hoping you might spare a moment for an old friend." The hobbit's expression shifted subtly, uncertainty replacing his automatic politeness. "Old friend? I'm afraid I don't. That is, I'm sure I would remember." He trailed off, studying the wizard's face with growing recognition. "Wait, the eyes and the way you hold your staff. Surely you're not... You can't be..." "Gandalf the Grey," Mithrandos said, using the name by which he had been known in the Shire during his previous visits. "Though I confess the grey has gone rather more to white since last we met. May I come in? I have much to tell you." and I fear some of it will not wait for more convenient times. Bilbo stepped back automatically, his hobbit-bred hospitality overcoming his caution. Of course. Come in, please. I was just sitting down to dinner, and there's more than enough for two. Though I must say, Gandalf, you've changed. There's something different about you, something—" He gestured vaguely, unable to find the words for what he sensed. "Something that speaks of dark places and dangerous deeds," the wizard supplied gently as he entered the familiar comfort of Bag End's main hall. "Yes, I imagine there is. The years since our last meeting have not been kind, Master Baggins. The world grows darker with each passing season, and even the Shire cannot remain untouched forever." They settled in the sitting room, where a fire crackled cheerfully in the grate, and the walls were lined with books whose chief virtue was their comfortable familiarity rather than any profound wisdom they might contain. Bilbo bustled about, producing tea and seed cake with the automatic efficiency of a good host, though his movements betrayed a nervous energy that had not been there in their earlier meetings. "Now then," he said when they were both settled with cups in hand, "what brings you back to the Shire after all these years? And please don't tell me it's another adventure. I've had quite enough of those for one lifetime. Thank you very much." Mithrandos sipped his tea, savoring the simple pleasure of a well-brewed cup in peaceful surroundings. It might be the last such moment he would know for a very long time. "Tell me, Bilbo," he said finally, "have you noticed anything unusual lately? Strange dreams, perhaps? Whispers in the wind? A sense that something watches from the shadows?" The hobbit's face went pale, and his cup rattled against its saucer as he set it down with unsteady hands. "How did you— surely it's just my imagination. The result of too much rich food and too little exercise, no doubt. Dr. Proudfoot says that dreams are simply the mind's way of clearing out the day's accumulated nonsense. Dr. Proudfoot is a wise hobbit, but there are kinds of knowledge that do not come from medical texts," Mithrandos said gently. "The dreams you speak of, do they feature a golden ring by any chance? Something that calls to you in the darkness, promising power and dominion over all who would oppose you?" Bilbo's face went from pale to ashen, and his hands moved instinctively to his waistcoat pocket. How could you possibly? That is to say—" He stopped, drawing himself up with the stubborn dignity that was the hobbit's greatest strength. "Very well. Yes, I have such dreams. And yes, there is a ring. But it's mine, Gandalf. I found it fair and square, and I've had it for years without any harm coming to me or mine." The wizard nodded slowly, though his heart was heavy with the confirmation of his fears. "May I see it, old friend? I promise, I mean no harm, to you or to the ring itself. But there are things I must know, questions that can only be answered by examining it directly." For a long moment, Bilbo hesitated, his hand still pressed protectively over his pocket. The internal struggle was visible on his face, the natural hobbit desire to help a friend warring against something deeper and more possessive. Finally, with visible effort, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple band of gold. It seemed utterly unremarkable at first glance, just a plain ring such as any jeweler might craft. But as Mithrandos looked upon it, he felt the weight of ages pressing down upon his spirit. This was no mere trinket, no simple ornament of precious metal. This was the one ring, the master ring, the device that bound all others to its will. In its making, the Dark Lord had poured much of his own power, and that power still lingered, waiting for the moment when it could return to its maker. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Bilbo said, his voice taking on a dreamy quality. "So smooth, so perfect. Sometimes I think it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And it's mine, all mine. Precious, precious." The wizard reached out carefully, not touching the ring, but holding his hand near enough to feel its influence. The malice was subtle but unmistakable, a whisper of temptation that promised to fulfill every desire, answer every need, solve every problem. It would be so easy to reach out, to claim it, to use its power for good ends. With great effort, he pulled his hand back. "It is beautiful," he agreed quietly, "and terrible beyond measure. Bilbo, this ring is not what it seems. It is an artifact of great power created by the enemy for his own dark purposes. Even now, as we speak, his servants search for it. Soon they will come to the Shire, and when they do—" "No." Bilbo clutched the ring to his chest, his eyes blazing with sudden fury. "It's mine. I won't let anyone take it from me. You can't have it, Gandalf. No one can have it." The transformation was shocking in its suddenness. Gone was the comfortable, well-fed hobbit of moments before, replaced by something fierce and possessive that would kill to protect its treasure. For an instant, Mithrandos glimpsed what Bilbo might become if the ring's influence continued to grow, a creature like Gollum, twisted by desire and driven mad by loss. But then the moment passed, and Bilbo blinked in confusion, the ring falling from suddenly nerveless fingers to roll across the carpet. What did I just say? Gandalf, I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me. It's just that the ring it's been with me for so long, and I've grown rather fond of it." Mithrandos made no move to retrieve the fallen ring, though every instinct screamed at him to secure it before its power could work further mischief. "The ring chooses its bearers carefully," he said instead. "It seeks those who can serve its purposes, who can carry it closer to its ultimate destination. You have borne it faithfully, old friend, but the time has come to pass the burden to another." "Another?" Bilbo's voice was small, frightened. "But who? Who else could possibly—" "Oh." Understanding dawned in his eyes, along with something that might have been relief. "You mean Frodo, don't you? My nephew. He's always been special, that one. Braver than he knows, stronger than he appears." The wizard nodded gravely. "The ring will not remain hidden much longer. Already the enemy's servants draw near, following signs and portents that grow stronger with each passing day. When they come, they will spare no one in their search. Not you, not your neighbors, not the children who play in the lanes. The only hope is to remove the ring from the Shire entirely, to take it far from here before the darkness falls." They talked long into the night, wizard and hobbit, while the ring lay forgotten on the carpet between them. Mithrandos spoke of the great war that was coming, of the alliances being forged, and the ancient powers stirring to meet the threat. He told of Thorin's quest to reclaim Erebor, of the corruption spreading through the route roads, of the Palantir's visions and the price of victory. And gradually, reluctantly, Bilbo came to understand the magnitude of what was asked of him. Not just to give up his precious ring, but to send his beloved nephew into deadly peril for the sake of all the world. "It's not fair," he said, at last, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Frodo has done nothing to deserve such a burden. He's happy here, content with his books and his garden and his simple pleasures. Why should he be asked to risk everything for people he's never met, in lands he's never seen? Because, Mithrandos replied gently, the ring has chosen him, just as it once chose you. And because sometimes the smallest person can make the greatest difference. The proud and mighty think themselves above the touch of such simple magic, but hobbits have a strength that even they do not recognize. As dawn broke over the Shire, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, they made their plans. Frodo would be told the truth, or as much of it as was safe to share. A company would be gathered, companions chosen for their courage and loyalty rather than their skill at arms. And when all was ready, they would set out upon the longest road ever traveled, carrying with them the hope and fear of all the world. The quiet time was ending. The great adventure was about to begin. The meeting took place in the deep halls beneath the prancing pony, in chambers that few guests ever saw and fewer still suspected existed. Here, where the stone walls had been carved by dwarf masons in the elder days and warded with spells of concealment that had endured through long centuries, the conspirators gathered to set in motion the events that would shake the very foundations of the world. Thorin Oakenshield sat at the head of the rough-hewn table, his fingers tracing the lines of an ancient map that showed the lonely mountain in all its former glory. The parchment was yellow with age, its edges cracked and worn from countless foldings, but every detail remained clear. The secret passages, the hidden entrances, the vast halls where the treasure of kings lay waiting beneath the dragon's guard. Around him sat his most trusted companions, Balin the Wise, whose white beard spoke of years spent in study and contemplation, Dwalin the Strong, whose war hammer had never failed him in battle, Fili and Kili, young princes whose eyes burned with the fire of youth and righteous anger. 12 in all they numbered, each sworn to the quest by bonds deeper than blood, stronger than steel. But it was the 13th member of their company who commanded the room's attention, though he spoke least and sat furthest from the light. Bilbo Baggins seemed utterly out of place among these weathered warriors, his comfortable waistcoat and polished buttons a stark contrast to their battle-scarred mail and travel-worn leather. Yet Mithrandos had insisted upon his inclusion, speaking of qualities that lay hidden beneath the hobbit's respectable exterior. "The path is treacherous," Thorin was saying, his voice low but carrying clearly in the stone chamber. "We must cross the misty mountains at their most perilous point, traverse the dark depths of Mirkwood, and approach the mountain from the north, where Smaug's attention is least likely to fall. Even then, our chances of success are slim." Balin stroked his white beard thoughtfully. "The dragon has slept for 60 years, undisturbed in his lair, but dragons sleep lightly, and the merest sound may wake him to fury. How do we propose to enter Erebor without rousing his wrath?" "We don't," Mithrandos said quietly, stepping from the shadows where he had been standing silent and still. His white robes seemed to glow with their own inner light, and his staff hummed with barely contained power. "That is, we don't avoid waking him. Smaug must be roused from his slumber if your people are ever to reclaim their home." The dwarves muttered among themselves, their voices rising in protest and alarm. To deliberately wake a dragon seemed the height of folly, tantamount to suicide. But Thorin raised his hand for silence, his eyes fixed upon the wizard, with an intensity that spoke of desperate hope warring against pragmatic fear. "Explain," he commanded simply. "The dragon is old," Mithrandos began, his voice taking on the cadence of one who spoke from deep knowledge. "His flames burn less hot than in his youth. His scales have grown brittle with age, and his attention has grown lazy with long security. More importantly, he has grown prideful, convinced of his own invincibility, contemptuous of any who might dare challenge him." He moved to the map, pointing to a section that showed the mountain's southern approaches. "Here, at the hidden door that your ancestors carved in the elder days, lies your best hope. The dragon knows of its existence, but dismisses it as too small a threat to merit his attention. A handful of determined warriors might enter undetected while Smaug's attention is focused elsewhere." "And how," asked Dwalin, with typical dwarf bluntness, "do we propose to focus his attention elsewhere?" The wizard smiled, and there was something both sad and terrible in that expression. "By giving him what he has always craved above treasure itself, the chance to demonstrate his power to the world. When word spreads that the mountain stirs, that heroes have come to challenge the mighty Smaug, his pride will compel him to emerge from his lair and show himself in all his terrible glory." Understanding dawned in the dwarves' eyes, along with a mixture of admiration and horror at the audacity of the plan. They would use the dragon's own nature against him, his vanity and arrogance becoming the weapons of his destruction. "And the black arrows?" Thorin asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The wind lance of Esgaroth, that alone can pierce dragonhide." "Still exists," Mithrandos confirmed. "Hidden in the ruins of Dale, waiting for the hand that can draw it and the eye that can aim it true. When Smaug emerges from his mountain, there will be those ready to greet him with the welcome he deserves." The planning continued deep into the night, every detail examined and re-examined, every contingency prepared for as far as mortal wisdom could provide. Maps were studied, supplies calculated, weapons checked and rechecked. When at last they emerged into the grey light of dawn, 13 companions and 1 hobbit had become something more, a company bound by shared purpose and common destiny. Bilbo stood at the edge of the group, his hands shaking slightly as he contemplated the magnitude of what lay ahead. The comfortable routines of Bag End seemed very far away now, replaced by the prospect of dangers he could barely imagine. Yet when Mithrandos approached and asked if he was ready, the hobbit straightened his shoulders and nodded with quiet determination. "I suppose I am," he said, his voice steady despite his fears. "Though I can't say I understand why you need a burglar for this venture. I've never stolen so much as an apple from a neighbor's tree." "Perhaps," the wizard replied gently, "that is precisely why we need you. The best locks are not always opened by the cleverest keys, Master Baggins. Sometimes what is required is not skill or strength, but simple honesty, the ability to see truly and speak plainly, unencumbered by the weight of too much wisdom or the burden of too much experience." As the company prepared to depart Bree and set out upon the long road to the mountain, none could know what trials awaited them in the wild places of the world, but each carried with him the hope that courage and determination might yet triumph over the darkness that threatened to engulf all the lands of the free. The quest for Erebor had begun, and with it, the first movement in a greater symphony of war and sacrifice that would determine the fate of all who dwelt beneath the sky. The wheel of prophecy turned, and the echoes of its turning would be heard in the halls of the mighty and the cottages of the simple alike. In the Shire, a nephew prepared for the greater burden that would soon be his. In Rivendell, the wise made ready for trials beyond imagining. And in the deep places of the world, ancient powers stirred in response to the changes that swept across the lands like wildfire. The second darkness was upon them, but it would not find the free peoples unprepared. Hope remained, fragile but unbroken, and in hope lay the seed of ultimate victory. The dragon's roar shattered the morning stillness like thunder from a clear sky, rolling across the desolate landscape with a force that shook the very foundations of the earth. Birds fell dead from the air, their hearts stopped by the pure malevolence in that sound, while lesser creatures fled in panic toward any shelter they could find. In the ruins of Dale, ancient stones cracked and crumbled, unable to withstand the resonance of such primal fury. Smaug the Terrible had awakened. From his vantage point on the rocky outcrop known as the Watchman's Peak, Mithrandos observed the dragon's emergence with a mixture of satisfaction and dread. The plan was working exactly as he had hoped, and that was precisely what terrified him. Dragons were creatures of elemental destruction, forces of nature given malicious intelligence and the power to act upon their darkest impulses. To wake such a being deliberately was to court disaster on a scale that few mortals could comprehend. The great worm emerged from the mountain's depths like a living avalanche, his scales gleaming like burnished copper in the morning light. He was vast beyond imagination, stretching from snout to tail tip, more than 200 feet. His wings went spread, casting shadows that could engulf entire villages. Steam rose from his nostrils with each breath, and his eyes burned with the fires of the earth's heart. But it was not his size alone that made him terrible. It was the intelligence that gleamed in those burning orbs, the malicious cunning that had allowed him to survive when all his kin had perished. Smaug was no mere beast to be slain by courage and sharp steel. He was ancient, wise in the ways of war and death, and utterly without mercy for any living thing that dared oppose him. "Who dares disturb my slumber?" the dragon roared, his voice like breaking mountains. "What miserable worms have crept into my halls, thinking to claim what is mine by right of conquest?" From deep within Erebor came the sound of battle. Dwarf voices raised in the ancient war cries of their people, the ring of steel on stone, the crash of falling masonry as passages long sealed were broken open by desperate hands. Thorin and his company had entered the mountain through the secret door, just as planned, and were now fighting their way toward the dragon's horde through tunnels that had not echoed with such sounds for more than half a century. Smaug's great head swiveled toward the mountain's depths, his eyes narrowing as he listened to the sounds of intrusion. For a moment, he hesitated, torn between the desire to crush the invaders immediately and the even stronger urge to savor their terror before destroying them. Pride won, as Mithrandos had known it would. "So," the dragon hissed, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried farther than his loudest roar. "The sons of Durin return at last to reclaim their pitiful kingdom. How touching, how perfectly, deliciously futile." He began to descend into the mountain's depths, his massive form flowing through passages that seemed far too small to contain him. The very stone groaned under his weight, and behind him he left a trail of molten rock where his heat had melted the ancient walls. This was the moment Mithrandos had been waiting for. The dragon's attention focused inward, his massive bulk committed to the narrow confines of the mountain's interior. With movements swift and sure, the wizard descended from his watching place and made his way toward the ruins of Dale, where another part of the plan waited to unfold. In the deepest cellars of what had once been the city's greatest armory, hidden beneath tons of rubble and protected by spells of concealment that had endured through decades of abandonment, lay the weapon that could end the dragon's reign forever. The black arrow of Esgaroth was no ordinary projectile. It had been forged in the elder days by smiths who knew the secret of making steel that could bite dragon scale, blessed by priests whose words still held power over the creatures of fire and shadow. But the arrow alone was not enough. It required a bow strong enough to drive it home, an eye keen enough to find the one vulnerable spot in the dragon's armored hide, and above all, a heart brave enough to stand firm when death itself came swooping down from the sky. Bard the bowman was waiting when Mithrandos arrived at the ruins, his weathered face grim with determination and the weight of inherited duty. He was the last of the line of Dale's kings, though few remembered that ancient heritage now. His ancestors had ruled this city when it was the greatest trading center of the north, and in their blood ran the memory of the dragon's first coming. "The wind is from the north," Bard said without preamble, testing his bowstring with the practiced ease of one who had lived by his skill with the weapon since childhood. "That will drive any arrow true if the hand that looses it does not falter." "Your hand will not falter," Mithrandos replied with quiet certainty. "This is your destiny, Bard, son of Brand. You were born for this moment, trained for it through all the years of exile and hardship. When Smaug emerges from the mountain, you will be ready." From within, Erebor came new sounds, the crash of tremendous impacts, the crack of splintering stone, the roar of flames hot enough to melt iron. The dragon had found his quarry and was driving them before him like leaves in a hurricane. Soon, very soon, he would emerge into the open air, drunk on his own power and ready to demonstrate his supremacy to all who dared witness it. "There," Mithrandos said, pointing to a gap in the mountainside where fire was beginning to show. "He comes." Smaug burst from the mountain like a comet of destruction, his wings spread wide, his mouth open in a roar of triumphant fury. Behind him came the dwarves, scattered and fleeing, some wounded, others helping their injured companions to safety. They had accomplished their purpose. The dragon was roused, angry, and fully committed to the attack. The great worm circled the mountain once, twice, his keen eyes scanning the landscape for further signs of his enemies. Then his gaze fell upon the ruins of Dale, and in particular upon the two figures who stood outlined against the morning sky, a man with a bow and a wizard with a staff of power. "Ah," Smaug hissed, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "More insects come to challenge the mighty Smaug. How delightful. It has been so long since I had proper sport." He folded his wings and dove, his massive form plummeting toward the ruins like a falling star. Fire streamed from his jaws, turning the very air to flame, while his claws extended to rend and tear. This was death incarnate, destruction given form and purpose. Bard drew his bow to full extension, the black arrow nocked and ready. His eyes were fixed not on the dragon's terrible head or gaping maw, but on a small spot just beneath the left wing where the scales grew thin and the ancient armor showed a gap no larger than a man's hand. One shot, one chance, and if he missed... Now, Mithrandos said quietly. The arrow flew true, its enchanted steel cutting through the air with a sound like singing crystal. Smaug saw it coming and tried to twist aside, but momentum and gravity conspired against him. The point took him precisely where Bard had aimed, sliding between the scales to pierce the dragon's heart with surgical precision. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the great worm hung motionless in the air, his eyes wide with shock and the first taste of his own mortality. Then he crashed to earth with an impact that shattered what remained of Dale's walls, his death cry echoing across the wasteland like the end of the world itself. The fire drake of the north was dead, and the mountain was free. But even as the echoes of Smaug's final roar faded into silence, new sounds could be heard in the distance. The tramp of marching feet, the clash of arms, the war horns of enemies who had waited long for this moment. The dragon's death had been a signal, and those who served the darkness were already moving to claim the prize that victory had revealed. The Battle of Five Armies was about to begin, and with it, the first great test of the alliances that would determine the fate of all the free peoples of the world. In the depths of Barad-dûr, the dark tower that pierced the sky like a spear of concentrated malice, the news of Smaug's death struck like a physical blow. The great fortress shuddered as its master's rage found expression in earthquakes and eruptions of flame that turned the surrounding landscape into a vision of the world's ending. From every rampart and tower, the screams of tortured metal rang out as the very stones themselves recoiled from the fury of their lord. The Dark Lord Sauron stood upon the highest pinnacle of his tower, his form wreathed in shadow and flame, his single eye blazing with a hatred that could melt steel and shatter mountains. For centuries, he had planned, schemed, and prepared for this moment, the time when all his enemies would be weakened, scattered, and ripe for conquest. The dragon's presence in the north had been a key element of his strategy, keeping the dwarves divided and the lands beyond the mountains weak and vulnerable. Now that carefully laid plan lay in ruins, destroyed by the very forces he had sought to manipulate. The mountain was free, the dwarves would unite, and worse still, the enemy had acted with a coordination and foresight that spoke of intelligence beyond mere mortal cunning. Someone was working against him, someone with the wisdom to see through his deceptions and the power to act upon that knowledge. Mithrandos, he hissed, the name falling from his lips like a curse that poisoned the very air. The White Wizard had interfered once too often, had proven himself too dangerous to ignore any longer. Plans would have to be accelerated, forces committed earlier than he had wished. But the alternative was to allow his enemies time to strengthen themselves further. He turned from his contemplation of the northern mountains and descended into the depths of his tower, where his most trusted servants waited for his commands. The vast halls of Barad-dûr echoed with his footsteps, each impact ringing like a hammer blow against the anvil of creation itself. Here was power beyond mortal comprehension, malice refined to its purest essence, and will made manifest in stone and steel. In the chamber of command, a circular room whose walls were covered with maps showing every corner of the world. His generals and lieutenants had gathered. 9 there were, cloaked and hooded, so that their faces could not be seen, though the aura of dread that surrounded them spoke clearly of what they had become. These were the Nazgûl, the ringwraiths, once great kings and sorcerers who had accepted rings of power from their master's hand and been enslaved by that gift. At their head stood the Witch King of Angmar, mightiest of the 9, whose blade could slay with a touch, and whose very presence was enough to freeze the blood of the bravest warrior. He had once been a king in his own right, ruler of a realm that stretched from sea to sea, but pride and the lust for power had led him to accept Sauron's gift, and with it, an eternity of service to a will greater than his own. "Master," the Witch King spoke, his voice like the whisper of wind through empty tombs. "Your rage shakes the very foundations of the world. What would you have us do?" Sauron's eye fell upon each of his servants in turn, reading their thoughts as easily as words written upon parchment. They were eager for action, hungry for the chance to spread death and terror throughout the lands of their enemies. For too long they had been held in check, forced to work through subtlety and misdirection when their nature called for open warfare. "The time for stealth is ended," he said, his voice carrying such authority that the very stones of the chamber trembled. "Too long have we allowed our enemies to act while we merely reacted. No more. The northern mountain is taken, but it can be retaken. The dwarves may have united, but unity can be shattered. And the wizard..." His eye blazed brighter, and cracks appeared in the floor where his gaze fell. "The wizard has become too dangerous to ignore." He gestured toward the great map that dominated the chamber's center, and immediately the lights began to shift and change, showing the disposition of forces across the world. Red markers appeared in the east, representing the vast armies that he had been gathering in secret. Orcs and goblins from the deep places, men from the southern kingdoms who had bent the knee to his power, creatures of shadow and flame that had been bred for war and nothing else. "The assault begins at once," he commanded. "Strike hard, strike fast, and give the enemy no time to prepare proper defenses. The lonely mountain first. While they celebrate their victory over the dragon, they will not expect our legions to be already on the march. Overwhelm them with numbers, break their spirit with terror, and let none escape to carry word of their defeat." The Witch King bowed low, his crown of iron catching the fitful light. "It shall be as you command, Master. But what of the other kingdoms? Surely they will not stand idle while we destroy the mountain folk." "They will have troubles of their own," Sauron replied with satisfaction. "Even now, my agents move among them, sowing discord and doubt. The horse lords of Rohan will find their borders pressed by warg riders and orc bands. The men of Gondor will discover that their ancient enemies in the south have suddenly grown bold. And the elves..." He paused, savoring the thought. "The elves will learn that their hidden sanctuaries are not as secret as they believed." Additional markers appeared on the map, black arrows showing the movement of armies, red dots indicating targets of particular importance. It was a strategy of overwhelming force applied simultaneously across multiple fronts, designed to prevent any unified response and ensure that each kingdom fell in isolation. "What of the ring, Master?" asked another of the 9, his voice barely a whisper. "Does it still remain hidden among the small folk of the western lands?" Sauron's eye turned toward the far west, where the green lands of the Shire lay peaceful and unaware of the storm that was gathering. The ring calls to me across the leagues, its song growing stronger with each passing day. Soon, very soon, it will be within my grasp once more. And when it is, he raised his hand, and for a moment the shadow of the One Ring could be seen upon his finger, though the ring itself remained far away. When it is, all resistance will crumble, all hope will die, and the age of my dominion will begin at last. The Nazgûl departed to carry out their master's commands, flowing from the chamber like smoke given form. Behind them, Sauron remained alone with his maps and his plans, his eye fixed upon the distant mountains where his enemies celebrated their Pyrrhic victory. They thought themselves clever, these mortals and immortals who dared oppose him. They thought their small triumphs mattered in the greater scheme of things. They would learn otherwise, and the learning would cost them everything they held dear. In the armories beneath Barad-dûr, the forges blazed day and night as weapons were shaped for the coming war. Swords that could cleave through the finest mail, spears that never missed their mark, armor that turned aside even enchanted blades. All flowed from those hellish workshops in numbers beyond counting. The very air rang with the sound of hammer on anvil, as if the tower itself was singing a song of war and destruction. And in the deepest dungeons, where even the light of the fires could not penetrate, things stirred that had not seen the outer world since the first age of the world. Ancient servants of the darkness, creatures of such malice and power that even their master used them sparingly, began to stir in response to his call. When they emerged at last, they would herald the beginning of the final war, the conflict that would determine whether light or shadow would rule the world for all the ages to come. The blade of war had not yet been drawn from its sheath, but already its keen edge could be felt across the lands of the free. Soon, very soon, it would taste blood, and once it began to drink, it would not be satisfied until every enemy of the darkness had been consumed. The storm was gathering, and its fury would shake the very pillars of heaven. The great halls of Erebor rang with sound and song for the first time in 3 generations, their vaulted ceilings echoing with the voices of the mountain folk as they celebrated the restoration of their ancient kingdom. Torches blazed in sconces that had stood empty since the dragon's coming, their light revealing the incredible artistry of the dwarf masons who had carved these chambers from the living rock. Here was beauty beyond price, pillars carved to resemble the great trees of the world's youth, walls adorned with murals depicting the heroic deeds of kings long dead, floors inlaid with gems that caught and reflected the torchlight like captured stars. But it was not the splendor of the halls that brought tears to dwarven eyes, nor the sight of the great hoard that Smaug had guarded so jealously. It was the simple fact of being home again, of walking paths their fathers had walked, of breathing air that carried the scent of forge fires and the memory of hammers ringing on anvils. The mountain lived again, and with it, the hopes and dreams of a people too long in exile. Thorin Oakenshield stood upon the throne of his fathers, the Arkenstone blazing upon his brow like a star fallen to earth. The great gem had been recovered from the dragon's hoard, and with it, the last symbol of royal authority that legitimized his claim to the Mountain Kingdom. Around him, the dwarven lords who had answered his call knelt in homage, their axes and hammers laid before the throne in token of their loyalty. "Rise, my kinfolk," Thorin commanded, his voice carrying clearly through the vast throne room. "Today we are no longer exiles and wanderers, but free dwarves in our own halls once more. Today we reclaim not just a mountain, but our heritage, our honor, and our place among the great kingdoms of the world." The cheers that greeted his words were like thunder in the confined space, rolling from wall to wall and seeming to shake the very foundations of the mountain. But even as the celebration reached its peak, darker thoughts intruded upon the joy of victory. The dragon was dead, yes, but his death had been heard across the world, and already word was spreading that Erebor's treasures lay unguarded once more. Mithrandos stood at the rear of the great hall, his white robes making him clearly visible among the brown and grey garments of the dwarves. He had said little during the ceremonies, content to observe and remember, but his presence was a reminder that greater affairs than the reclaiming of a single kingdom were at stake. The wizard's face was grave with knowledge of what was to come, and those who looked closely could see the weight of prophecy in his ancient eyes. "You have won a great victory," he said to Thorin when the king descended from his throne to speak with him privately. "The mountain is yours again, and with it, the strength to forge weapons and armor that could turn the tide of the coming war. But victory brings its own dangers, my friend. Even now, dark armies march from the east, drawn by the scent of gold and the promise of easy conquest." Thorin's face hardened, the joy of triumph fading as he contemplated the wizard's words. "Let them come," he said grimly. "We have reclaimed our home, and we will defend it to the last dwarf. These halls have seen siege before, and their walls have never been breached by any enemy. These halls have never faced such enemies as are coming now," Mithrandos replied gently. "The forces that march against you are not mere raiders seeking plunder, but armies of the Dark Lord himself, sent to crush any hope of resistance before it can take root. You cannot stand alone against such numbers." The king was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving across the celebrating dwarves who filled his hall. They had suffered so much, endured so many years of exile and hardship, and now, when they had finally won back their birthright, he was being asked to risk it all again in a conflict that was not of their making. "What would you have me do?" he asked finally. "My people have just returned home. Am I to march them out again so soon, to fight in wars that are not theirs?" "Not march out," the wizard said, "but welcome in. Send word to all the free peoples, men, elves, even the hobbits of the distant Shire. Tell them that Erebor stands ready to be the anvil upon which the enemy's plans will be broken. Offer them shelter within your walls. Forge for them weapons of dwarf steel that can bite through orcish mail. And when the final battle comes, stand with them as brothers in arms." As they spoke, a commotion arose at the hall's great doors. A messenger had arrived, travel-stained and bearing the marks of hard riding. He wore the colors of Dale, the city that had been built anew among the ruins of the old, and his face was grim with urgent news. "My lord king," he gasped, falling to one knee before the throne. "I bring word from King Bard, the Dragon Slayer. Our scouts report vast movements in the east. Armies beyond counting march toward our lands. Orcs and goblins, wolves and wargs, and creatures whose names are spoken only in whispers. They will be here within the fortnight." The celebration died, as if a cold wind had blown through the hall, replaced by the grim silence of warriors preparing for battle. But there was no panic, no despair, only the calm determination of a people who had survived the dragon's wrath and would not be easily cowed by any earthly enemy. Thorin mounted his throne once more, the Arkenstone blazing upon his brow like a beacon of defiance. "Then we prepare for war," he declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "Send word to our kinfolk in the Iron Hills and the Grey Mountains. Call upon the men of Dale and Esgaroth and any others who would stand with us against the darkness. Let the forges burn day and night. Let every sword be sharpened and every arrow fletched. When the enemy comes, they will find not helpless refugees, but the full fury of the mountain folk roused to righteous wrath." The dwarves roared their approval, their voices rising in the ancient battle songs of their people. Axes were raised, hammers pounded upon shields, and the mountain itself seemed to ring like a great bell struck by mighty hands. This was the sound of a people who had found their courage again, who had remembered what it meant to stand and fight for something greater than themselves. But even as the dwarves prepared for siege, other forces were moving across the world. In the elven realms, the horns of war were sounding for the first time in centuries. In the kingdoms of men, ancient alliances were being renewed and old grudges set aside in the face of common peril. And in the distant Shire, a certain hobbit was preparing for a journey that would take him farther from home than any of his kind had ever traveled. The kingdom was reclaimed, but the true test of its strength was yet to come. When the armies of darkness finally arrived at the gates of Erebor, they would find not just a mountain full of treasure, but a fortress manned by heroes who had already proven that even dragons could be slain by those brave enough to stand against them. The battle of 5 armies was about to become the battle of all free peoples, and its outcome would determine whether the light or the shadow would rule the world for all the ages to come. In the deepest forges of the mountain, where the greatest smiths worked by the light of fires that had burned since the world's youth, weapons were being shaped that would become legend. Swords that could cleave through the toughest armor, shields that could turn aside the mightiest blows, and one blade in particular, a sword forged from star metal and blessed with runes of power, that was destined to play a crucial role in the battles ahead. The kingdom was reclaimed, but the war for its survival had only just begun. "How much farther?" Frodo asked, pausing at the crest of a hill that overlooked the peaceful vale of Hobbiton. From here, he could see Bag End's round door, painted the familiar green that had been his uncle's pride, and the garden where he had spent so many happy hours reading beneath the old oak tree. "To Rivendell?" Mithrandos replied, following his gaze toward the distant spires of that hidden sanctuary. 7 days of hard riding, if the roads remain clear and we encounter no delays. But I fear the roads will not remain clear much longer. Already my enemies move to intercept us, drawn by the ring's presence like moths to a candle flame. As if summoned by his words, a shadow passed over the sun. Not the natural shadow of a cloud, but something deeper and more malevolent. The temperature dropped perceptibly, and the birds that had been singing in the hedgerows fell suddenly silent. Somewhere in the distance, a dog began to howl, its voice thin with terror. "They come," the wizard said quietly, his hand tightening upon his staff. "The 9 ride forth from their master's tower, and their hunger for the ring burns like a fever in their ancient bones. We must reach the Bruinen before they overtake us, for beyond that river they cannot pass without great cost to themselves. They rode hard through the remainder of that day and into the night, their horses' hooves striking sparks from the ancient stones of the East Road. Behind them, always behind them, came the sound of pursuit, the thunder of hoofbeats that seemed to shake the very earth, the cries of hunters who knew no mercy and would accept no surrender. The ring grew heavier with each mile, its voice more insistent, its promises more seductive. "Why do you flee?" it whispered to Frodo as they rode. "Turn back, return to the green places where you were happy. Use our power to defend your home, to make yourself mighty among your people. What need have you for wizards and their schemes?" But Frodo had learned something of wisdom in the months since Gandalf had first revealed the ring's true nature. He knew that its promises were lies wrapped in desire, that its gifts came with a price no mortal soul could afford to pay. So he held tight to his saddle and urged his pony onward, even as the darkness closed in around them like a living thing. On the second night, as they sheltered in the ruins of an ancient watchtower, the attack finally came. The Nazgûl struck without warning, their black steeds leaping impossible distances, their riders cloaked in shadow and despair. Where they passed, the very air seemed to wither, and strong men would have fallen to their knees in terror at the mere sight of them. But Mithrandos was no ordinary man, and the light that blazed from his staff was not the common radiance of torch or candle. It was the secret fire itself, the flame that had kindled the first stars and would burn until the world's ending. Where it touched, the creatures of shadow, they recoiled as if struck by physical blows, their forms wavering like smoke in a strong wind. "Back!" the wizard commanded, his voice carrying such authority that even the ringwraiths hesitated. "Back to the darkness that spawned you. You have no power here while the light endures." The battle that followed was brief but terrible, fought on levels beyond the merely physical. Reality itself seemed to bend and twist as two fundamental forces clashed: the power of domination that drove the Nine against the secret fire that burned within the wizard's staff. Lightning crackled between them, but it was not the lightning of storms. This was raw energy torn from the fabric of creation itself. In the end, it was not Mithrandos who decided the battle's outcome, but the ring itself. As the conflict reached its peak, with the very stones of the watchtower beginning to crack under the strain, the golden band suddenly blazed with its own inner light, not the clean radiance of the wizard's power, but something older and more complex, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. The Nazgûl screamed as one, their voices like breaking glass, and fled into the night. For all their power, for all their master's authority, they could not overcome the ring's own defenses when it chose to protect itself. It wanted to reach Mount Doom, wanted to return to the fires of its creation, and it would not allow even its master's servants to prevent that homecoming. "Curious," Mithrandos murmured as the echoes of their retreat faded into silence. "The ring protects you, Master Baggins, though not from any love it bears you. It seeks its own purposes, and for now, those purposes align with ours." They reached Rivendell as the sun set on the third day, riding across the hidden bridge that spanned the rushing waters of the Bruinen just as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The valley lay before them like a vision of peace made manifest. Its gardens blooming with flowers that had no names in the common tongue. Its halls filled with music that spoke of joy without ending. But even here, in this last sanctuary of the ancient wisdom, the shadow of the ring's presence could be felt. The elves who greeted them did so with courtesy, but also with a wariness that had not been there in happier times. They knew what burden Frodo carried, and they understood the magnitude of the sacrifice that would be required to see it destroyed. Elrond the Wise received them in the Hall of Fire, where the flames danced without fuel and the light never dimmed. He was ancient beyond mortal comprehension, his face bearing the weight of ages spent in service to the cause of good, yet his eyes remained bright with unquenchable hope. "So," he said, his voice carrying the music of distant seas, "the ring-bearer comes at last to the house of Elrond. Long have we waited for this day, and long have we dreaded its coming. The burden you carry, young hobbit, is heavier than any one person should be asked to bear." Frodo drew the ring from its hiding place, holding it up so that its golden surface caught the firelight. It seemed so small, so innocent, yet every person in the hall could feel the weight of its presence. The whispered promises, the subtle corruption, the endless hunger for power and dominion. "What must I do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Gandalf, Mithrandos, tells me it must be destroyed, cast into the fires where it was made. But Mount Doom lies in the very heart of the enemy's realm, guarded by armies beyond counting. How can one hobbit hope to succeed where heroes would fail?" Elrond smiled, and in that smile was all the wisdom of the ages and all the love that the immortal bear for the mortal world. "Perhaps," he said gently, "that is precisely why you will succeed, Frodo Baggins. The enemy expects heroes, great warriors with bright swords and noble hearts. He does not expect a simple hobbit with no desire for glory, only the quiet courage to do what must be done." The Council of Elrond convened the next morning, bringing together representatives of all the free peoples to debate the ring's fate. There were elves and men, dwarves and wizards, and in their midst one small hobbit who carried the weight of all their hopes upon his shoulders. The debate was long and sometimes heated, for the ring's corruption touched even the wisest hearts, whispering of the good that could be accomplished if its power were turned to righteous purposes. But in the end, there was only one choice that honor would permit. The ring could not be used without corrupting its bearer, could not be hidden without eventually being found, could not be ignored without ensuring the victory of darkness. It had to be destroyed, no matter the cost, no matter the odds against success. "I will take it," Frodo said when the debate had run its course, his voice steady despite the terror that gripped his heart. "I will take the ring to Mount Doom, though I do not know the way." "I will help you bear this burden," came a voice from the back of the hall, and Sam Gamgee stepped forward, his face set with the stubborn determination that was his greatest strength. "As far as it goes, even unto the end." Others joined them: Aragorn the Ranger, Boromir of Gondor, Legolas of the Woodland Realm, Gimli the Dwarf, and Mithrandos himself, though the wizard warned that he might not be able to accompany them for the entire journey. 9 they numbered in the end, the Fellowship of the Ring, bound together by oath and necessity to see the Dark Lord's creation unmade. As they prepared to depart Rivendell and begin the longest road ever travelled, Frodo felt the ring's weight more keenly than ever. It knew where they were going, knew what fate awaited it in the fires of Mount Doom, and its whispered protests grew more urgent with each passing hour. But he also felt something else, the strength that came from knowing he did not bear this burden alone, that others had chosen to share the danger and the sacrifice. Whatever trials lay ahead, whatever perils waited in the dark places of the world, he would face them with companions whose courage matched his own. The ring still slept, but its sleep was troubled now, filled with dreams of fire and ending. Soon, very soon, it would wake to find itself on the road to its own destruction, carried not by a hero or a king, but by the most unlikely bearer of all, a hobbit who wanted nothing more than to return to his garden and his books and his quiet life in the Shire. The wheel of fate turned, and with each revolution, it carried them closer to the moment when all would be decided, when the shadow would fall or the light would triumph, when the third age would end and the fourth begin, when the dominion of mortals would replace the time of the immortal guardians. The journey to Mount Doom had begun, and with it, the final chapter in the long war between light and darkness that had shaped the world since its creation. The fall of Dol Guldur came not with fire and thunder, but with a silence so profound it seemed to echo through the very bones of the earth. For 1,000 years, the Hill of Sorcery had stood as a monument to corruption, its twisted spires reaching toward heaven like accusing fingers, its dungeons filled with the screams of the tormented and the lost. From its heights, the necromancer had woven his web of shadow across the world, sending forth his servants to corrupt and destroy all that was fair and clean. Now it lay empty, its walls cracked and crumbling, its fires extinguished forever. The darkness that had filled it for so long had withdrawn, flowing eastward like a tide of poison returning to its source. But withdrawal was not defeat. It was strategy, a calculated retreat that served purposes darker than any who witnessed it could comprehend. Galadriel stood upon the hill's summit, her golden hair catching the first light of dawn as she surveyed the ruins of her ancient enemy's stronghold. Around her, the members of the White Council moved like ghosts through the abandoned chambers, cataloguing the horrors they found there and ensuring that no trace of the necromancer's corruption remained to poison the world's healing. "He is gone," she said to Elrond, who had materialized beside her with the silent grace that marked his kindred. "The shadow that dwelt here for so long has fled, leaving only emptiness behind. Yet I do not feel the joy that victory should bring. There is something here." She paused, her eyes distant with the perception that came to those who had lived since the world's youth. Something that speaks not of defeat, but of purpose fulfilled. Elrond nodded gravely, his own ancient wisdom confirming what she had sensed. He came here not to build a kingdom, but to prepare the way for his master's return. Every soul corrupted, every hope crushed, every act of malice committed within these walls, all of it was sacrifice upon the altar of a greater darkness. Now that the time of preparation is ended, he has no more need of this place. Below them, in the deepest dungeons where the necromancer had conducted his most terrible experiments, Radagast the Brown worked with desperate haste to heal what could be healed and ease the passing of what could not be saved. His face was streaked with tears as he moved among the ruins of what had once been living beings, his hands glowing with the gentle light of growing things, as he tried to bring peace to souls that had known only torment. "The corruption runs deeper than stone and mortar," he reported when he rejoined the others on the hilltop. "The very earth is poisoned, the water turned bitter, the air thick with malice that will take years to cleanse. But worse than that are the scars left upon the song itself. Discord where harmony should reign, silence where music should flow. He has wounded creation itself, and I fear some of those wounds may never heal." The White Council had come to Dol Guldur in strength, bringing with them all the power at their command. But they had arrived too late to prevent the necromancer's final working. The great ritual that had torn open the barriers between worlds and allowed his master's influence to flow freely across the earth. They could cleanse the hill, could seal its dungeons and scatter its stones, but they could not undo what had already been accomplished. "Look there," Galadriel said, pointing eastward toward the distant peaks of the Ash Mountains. "See how the very sky bleeds? That is the mark of his passage, the wound he has torn in the world's fabric. Through that breach, powers pour forth that have not walked the earth since the first darkness fell. We may have won this hill, but the greater war has only just begun." As if summoned by her words, a figure emerged from the ruins, tall and stately, clad in robes that had once been white but were now stained with ash and sorrow. Saruman the White, head of their order, leader of the council that had sworn to stand guard against the return of shadow. But there was something different about him now, something that made even his oldest allies regard him with unease. "The fortress is cleansed," he reported, his voice carrying its usual authority, but lacking the warmth that had once marked him as a friend and counselor. "Every stone has been examined, every chamber searched, every artifact of power secured or destroyed. The enemy has left nothing behind that could serve his purposes or ours." "And yet," Elrond observed quietly, "you seem troubled, old friend. What have you found in those depths that weighs so heavily upon your spirit?" For a moment, something flickered in Saruman's eyes. Pain, perhaps, or regret, or the shadow of knowledge too terrible to share. But then his expression smoothed, becoming the mask of calm wisdom that he wore before the world. "I have seen the scope of his preparations," he replied, carefully. The necromancer did not spend 1,000 years in idleness. Every soul he corrupted, every artifact he created, every spell he wove, all of it was done in service of a plan whose full dimensions we are only beginning to comprehend. The ring-bearer carries not just a burden, but the key to our enemy's ultimate victory or defeat. Galadriel's eyes sharpened, reading meanings in his words that he had not intended to reveal. "You speak as one who has looked too deeply into the darkness, Saruman. What have you seen that you do not share with us?" "I have seen the end of things," he replied, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "The final battle, the last alliance, the moment when all our choices and sacrifices will be weighed in the balance. And I have seen that the path to victory leads through shadows so deep that not all who enter them will emerge unchanged." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken fears and growing suspicions. Each member of the White Council had felt the weight of prophecy pressing upon them, had sensed that the end of an age was at hand. But in Saruman's words, they heard something more, a knowledge born not of wisdom, but of communion with the very darkness they had sworn to oppose. "The ring must be destroyed," Elrond said finally, breaking the silence with words that seemed to hang in the air like a pronouncement of doom. Whatever the cost, whatever the sacrifice required, that much is clear. While it exists, our enemy cannot be truly defeated. Destroyed. Saruman's voice carried a note of surprise that might have been genuine. Such a course seems precipitous. Surely there are other options to consider, other paths that might lead to victory without such drastic measures. The ring is a weapon of immense power. Perhaps it could be turned against its creator, used to accomplish the very ends he seeks to prevent. The suggestion hung in the air like poison, seductive and terrible in its implications. For a moment, none of the council members spoke, each wrestling with the temptation that Saruman had placed before them. To wield the ring's power in service of good, to turn the enemy's greatest weapon against him. What victories might be won, what suffering prevented, if they had the courage to seize such an opportunity? But Galadriel shook her head, her voice firm with the wisdom of ages. The ring cannot be used for good ends, no matter the nobility of the user's intentions. It was forged in malice and corruption, and all who wield it will be consumed by that darkness in time. No, Saruman, there is only one path that leads to true victory, and that is the path of sacrifice and renunciation. As you wish, Saruman replied, but his eyes held depths that had not been there before, and his smile was the smile of one who knew secrets that others did not share. I defer to your wisdom in this matter, as always. But if the ring-bearer should falter, if the burden should prove too great for hobbit shoulders to bear, then perhaps other options might be reconsidered. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving the others to wonder what shadows had touched his heart during his long sojourn in the ruins of the enemy's stronghold. The White Council dispersed shortly after, each member carrying away their own portion of the burden that the day's revelations had brought. But as they departed the Hill of Sorcery, none noticed the single figure that watched them from the deepest shadows, a shape that might have been a man or might have been something else entirely. It smiled as it observed their going, its eyes glowing with the cold light of stars dying in the void. The enemy had withdrawn, but he had not retreated. He had simply moved to a stronger position, one from which he could observe the moves of his opponents and plan his counter-strategies accordingly. The game was far from over. Indeed, it had barely begun. In the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains, though no clouds marred the morning sky. It was the sound of armies on the march, of the great war finally beginning in earnest. Soon the free peoples would learn what it truly meant to face the full fury of the darkness unleashed. But for now, there was only silence, the terrible silence of a victory that felt too much like defeat, of an enemy who had withdrawn only to strike with greater force from a position of greater strength. The hill was cleansed, but the shadow had found a new home in the heart of one who should have stood against it. The real battle was yet to come, and when it arrived, the forces of light would discover that their greatest enemy was not the Dark Lord in his tower, but the corruption that had taken root within their own ranks. The wheel of fate turned on, carrying them all toward a destiny that none could foresee and few would survive to witness. The great fires of Orodruin had burned low, their ancient fury spent in the moment of the ring's unmaking, where once the mountain of fire had thrust its peak toward heaven like a spear of molten rock. Now only a broken cone remained, its summit collapsed inward upon itself, its slopes dark with cooling lava and the ash of endings. The very air seemed lighter somehow, as if a weight that had pressed upon the world since its creation had finally been lifted. Mithrandos, though he bore that name no longer, having passed beyond the need for such mortal designations, stood upon the Samath Nar where the ring had met its doom. His form was changed, transfigured by the ordeal he had endured in the depths of Moria, and made luminous by the completion of his great task. Around him, the broken stones of the chamber glowed with a light that owed nothing to fire or flame, but came instead from the secret fire itself, the flame that kindled all creation. Before him, where the cracks of doom had once gaped like a wound in the world's heart, a pool of clear water had formed, not the bitter, sulphurous brew that Ikar had bubbled there for millennia, but water sweet and clean, fit to wash away the stains of ages. It reflected not the broken roof above, but the sky as it had been in the world's youth, when the stars sang together and every dawn brought new wonders to the waking earth. "It is finished," he said softly, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber despite his gentle tone. "The ring is unmade, its power scattered to the winds, its corruption cleansed from the circles of the world. The shadow that has lain across the earth for so long is finally lifted, and the fourth age of the world may begin in hope rather than fear." Behind him, the companions who had shared this ultimate trial stirred like sleepers waking from troubled dreams. Frodo lay unconscious still, his face peaceful for the first time since he had taken up the burden of the ring. The terrible weight that had pressed upon his spirit was gone at last, leaving behind only the quiet strength that had sustained him through all the dark miles of his journey. Sam knelt beside his master, tears streaming down his face as he felt the change that had come over both the mountain and the hobbit he had followed to the very edge of destruction. "Is it true, Mr. Gandalf?" he asked, his voice thick with wonder and disbelief. "Is it really over? Has the darkness been defeated at last?" The wizard, for such, he remained in the hearts of those who loved him, whatever transformations he might have undergone, smiled with infinite gentleness. "The darkness is defeated, dear Sam, though not destroyed. It retreats now to the uttermost parts of the earth, seeking places where the light does not penetrate and hope does not reach. But its dominion is broken, its power scattered, and never again will it threaten the free peoples with conquest and despair." Around them, the mountain continued its transformation. Where the fires of creation had once burned with destructive fury, now gentler flames danced, the hearth fires of renewal, the forge flames of new beginnings. The poisoned air that had choked the breath of all living things began to clear, replaced by winds that carried the scent of distant seas and growing things. From the slopes of the mountain came new sounds, not the roar of volcanic fury, but the trickle of water finding its way to the sea, the whisper of grass pushing through ash-covered soil, the tentative songs of birds returning to lands that had known only silence for far too long. Life was returning to Mordor, slowly but inevitably, transforming the Black Land into something that might one day bloom with flowers and ring with laughter. "What of the others?" Frodo asked, his voice weak but clear as consciousness returned to him. "Aragorn and Legolas, Gimli and Boromir, do they live? Did our sacrifice serve any purpose, or did we merely delay the inevitable?" "They live," the wizard assured him, his eyes bright with joy at the question. Even now they stand before the Black Gate, watching as the towers of Barad-dûr crumble into dust and the armies of the enemy flee in terror and confusion. Your sacrifice, all of your sacrifices, has served its purpose beyond any hope we dared to cherish. The war is won, the enemy defeated, and the age of peace may begin at last. As if summoned by his words, a great eagle appeared at the chamber's entrance. Gwaihir, the Wind Lord, mightiest of his kind, whose wings could bear riders across impossible distances. Upon his back rode others of his people, come to carry the ring-bearers away from the desolation of Orodruin to places where healing and rest awaited. Come, Gwaihir said, his voice like wind through mountain peaks. The hour of your triumph has arrived, but it should not be celebrated in this place of endings. There are green lands waiting for your return, and friends who long to welcome you home. They flew through skies that seemed clearer than any had been for generations, leaving behind the broken peaks of Mordor for the green lands of the west. Below them, the world was transforming. What had been wasteland was becoming fertile again. What had been poisoned was growing clean. What had been hopeless was flowering with new possibility. The Fourth Age had begun, the Age of Men, when the dominion of the mortal would replace the guardianship of the immortal. It would not be perfect, no age ever was, but it would be free, shaped by choices rather than fate, governed by hope rather than fear. In the years that followed, songs would be sung of the War of the Ring and the heroes who had fought in it. Bards would tell of Aragorn's kingship and the restoration of Gondor, of Legolas and Gimli's unlikely friendship that bridged the gap between elf and dwarf, of Sam's courage and Frodo's sacrifice. The tales would grow in the telling, as tales do, until they became legend and then myth. But those who lived through those days would remember the simpler truths, that courage could be found in the most unlikely hearts, that small hands could accomplish what mighty armies could not. That hope was the greatest weapon against despair. They would remember that the darkness had been defeated not by those who sought glory, but by those who sought only to do what was right. The wheel of the ages turned, carrying the world forward into an uncertain but hopeful future. The ring was destroyed, the shadow lifted, and the long watch of the wise was ended at last. What came next would be determined not by prophecy or doom, but by the choices of free peoples in a free world. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all, the victory of hope over fear, of light over darkness, of the small and humble over the mighty and proud. The Third Age was ended, but the Fourth had begun, and with it came the promise that even in the darkest hours, even when all seemed lost, there would always be those willing to stand against the night and kindle the flames of hope in the hearts of the faithful. The long defeat was over. The victory of the small hands had begun. Thus ends the tale of the rise of the shadow and its ultimate defeat, as recorded in the Red Book of Westmarch and the Chronicles of the Wise. May it serve as a reminder to all who read it that darkness, however deep, is never permanent, and that hope, however fragile, can never truly die while there remain hearts brave enough to shelter it.